The Thramas Sector occupied a position of critical strategic importance along the eastern fringe, serving as a nexus point for multiple stable warp routes that connected the 500 worlds of Ultramar to the distant heart of the Imperium at Terra. During the opening years of the Horus Heresy, these routes became lifelines of unparalleled value. The sector itself comprised dozens of inhabited systems, their populations numbering in the billions, with established infrastructure that had been built up over 2 centuries of Imperial expansion during the Great Crusade. Manufacturing centers, forge worlds, and agri-worlds dotted the region, each contributing to the vast logistical network that kept the Imperium's war machine functioning. The warp routes passing through Thramas were among the most reliable in the eastern fringe, requiring relatively shorter periods of translation through the immaterium compared to alternative paths. This reliability made them invaluable for moving fleets, armies, and supplies across the vast distances of the galaxy. When civil war erupted and brother turned against brother at Istvan III, the strategic calculus of the Imperium transformed overnight. Every sector, every fleet, every legion suddenly existed within a new context where loyalty could not be assumed and where the movement of forces took on existential importance. The Thramas Sector's position meant that any substantial Imperial force attempting to reach Terra from the eastern fringe would almost certainly need to utilize its warp routes. Conversely, any traitor force seeking to interdict reinforcements from Ultramar would find Thramas an ideal choke point. The sector had never been intended as a fortress or a battleground. Its worlds were productive, peaceful, and largely undefended beyond standard garrison forces and system defense fleets. None of this would save them from what was coming. The Night Lord's legion withdrew from the killing fields of Istvan V, with their armor still slick with the blood of their former brothers. The drop site massacre had seen 3 loyal legions nearly destroyed in a carefully orchestrated betrayal, and the 8th Legion had played their part with characteristic brutality. Yet even as the last survivors of the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands were being hunted through the black sands of Istvan V, Konrad Curze was already looking beyond the immediate slaughter. The Primarch of the Night Lords had always been cursed with visions of possible futures, fragmentary glimpses of what might come to pass that had tormented him since his youth on the nightmare world of Nostromo. These visions had grown more frequent and more intense as the heresy progressed, driving him toward decisions that seemed inexplicable to those who did not share his gift and his curse. Curze's visions showed him the eastern fringe, showed him worlds burning under the assault of his legion, showed him a confrontation with one of his brothers that felt inevitable in the way that only prophetic revelation could. The exact details remained maddeningly unclear, as they always did, but the general direction was unmistakable. The Night Lords would go east, and there they would find purpose in the greater design of the War Master's rebellion. Whether Curze understood Horus's strategic intentions, or whether he simply followed the pull of his own precognition remains a matter of historical debate, but the result was the same. The 8th Legion gathered its fleet, took on supplies from the traitor-held facilities at Istvan, and departed for the eastern fringe, while the other traitor legions consolidated their positions or moved toward their own objectives. The Dark Angels Legion had been far from Terra when the heresy began, prosecuting campaigns in the distant reaches of the galaxy as they had done throughout the Great Crusade. The First Legion carried a reputation as the Emperor's Chosen, the first of the Space Marine legions, bearing a proud history and a secretive culture that set them apart from their brother legions. When word of Horus's betrayal reached Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels immediately began the long journey back toward the throne world. The distances involved were staggering even by the standards of the Great Crusade. The warp routes were long, and the journey would take months even under the best circumstances. The Lion drove his fleet hard, pushing his navigators and his ships to their limits, but the galaxy was vast, and even a Primarch could not simply will his forces across it instantaneously. The delay that resulted from simple distance became a factor that Horus Lupercal, the War Master turned arch-traitor, incorporated into his strategic planning. The Dark Angels represented a significant military force, perhaps 50,000 Astartes strong, with a fleet that matched their numbers in power and capability. If the First Legion reached Terra and reinforced the Imperial Palace before Horus could bring his own forces to bear, the entire calculus of the siege that the War Master was already planning would shift unfavorably. The Dark Angels alone might not be enough to prevent the traitors from eventually breaching the palace walls, but they would exact a terrible price and buy time for other loyalist forces to arrive. Horus needed the Dark Angels neutralized, removed from the board during the critical opening moves of his rebellion. Direct confrontation was possible, but would require committing forces that the War Master needed elsewhere. A more elegant solution presented itself in the form of misdirection. The Night Lords' movement toward the eastern fringe created an opportunity. If the Dark Angels could be drawn into a protracted engagement far from Terra, they would be unable to reinforce the Emperor when the time came. The 8th Legion was expendable in this calculation, or at least more expendable than the forces Horus would need for the assault on the Imperial Palace itself. Curze and his Night Lords were vicious fighters and experts at the kind of terror warfare that could tie down an enemy force far larger than themselves, but they were also unpredictable and difficult to control. Sending them against the Dark Angels served multiple purposes. It would keep the First Legion occupied. It would allow the Night Lords to indulge their particular methods of warfare in a way that served the greater rebellion, and it would remove two potentially problematic variables from the immediate vicinity of the War Master's main forces. Intelligence reports began reaching Lionel Johnson as his fleet made its way toward Terra. The reports came from astropathic relay stations, from merchant vessels that had survived encounters with raiders, from Imperial garrisons that had managed to transmit warnings before being overwhelmed. The Night Lords were conducting a campaign of systematic terror across the eastern fringe, targeting worlds along the very warp routes that the Dark Angels' fleet was using. Entire populations were being subjected to atrocities that served no obvious military purpose. Cities were being depopulated, infrastructure was being destroyed, and the survivors were being left to spread word of what had been done to them. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone familiar with the 8th Legion's methods. This was not simple raiding for supplies or strategic destruction of military assets. This was terror for its own sake, warfare designed to break the will of populations and spread fear across entire sectors. The Lion faced a decision that would define the next 3 years of the heresy. The direct route to Terra lay open, though it would require bypassing the Thramas Sector and the systems currently under assault by the Night Lords. His orders were clear in their general intent, if not their specific wording: return to Terra, reinforce the Emperor, prepare for the coming storm. Yet the reports from Thramas detailed atrocities that offended every principle the Dark Angels claimed to uphold. Millions of Imperial citizens were dying, and more would follow if the Night Lords were allowed to continue their rampage unchecked. The strategic situation was more complex than simple moral outrage, however. If the Night Lords were allowed to secure control of the Thramas Sector, they would command the warp routes that any reinforcements from Ultramar would need to use. Roboute Guilliman and the 13th Legion represented the single largest loyalist force in the galaxy, but they would be trapped in the eastern fringe if the routes to Terra were cut. Lionel Johnson was a warrior who had learned strategy in the monster-haunted forests of Caliban, where hesitation meant death, and where the correct course of action was often the one that seemed most dangerous. He had built the Dark Angels into a legion that prided itself on its ability to make the hard choices, to do what was necessary regardless of the cost. The decision to pursue the Night Lords rather than continue directly to Terra was not made lightly, but once made, it was absolute. The Dark Angels would hunt Konrad Curze and his 8th Legion, would bring them to battle, and would eliminate the threat they posed to the eastern fringe. Only then would the 1st Legion continue to Terra. The Lion calculated that the delay would be measured in weeks, perhaps a few months at most. He would destroy the Night Lords quickly and decisively, as he had destroyed every enemy he had faced during the Great Crusade, and then continue his journey to the throne world. The orders went out through the Dark Angels' fleet. Navigators plotted new courses toward the Thramas Sector. Fleet elements that had been spread across multiple systems began to consolidate. The 1st Legion was going to war against the 8th, and the eastern fringe would burn in the fires of their conflict. The Dark Angels Legion that entered the Thramas Sector represented one of the most formidable military instruments ever created by the Emperor of Mankind. The First Legion had been the prototype, the first experiment in creating transhuman warriors capable of conquering the galaxy in the name of a unified humanity. 2 centuries of continuous warfare during the Great Crusade had refined the Dark Angels into a force that combined overwhelming firepower with tactical flexibility and an institutional memory that stretched back to the very beginning of the Space Marine project. The Legion's strength at the outbreak of the Heresy stood at approximately 50,000 Astartes, organized into chapters, battalions, and companies according to a structure that had evolved over decades of constant campaigning. What set the Dark Angels apart from many of their brother legions was not simply their size or their equipment, but rather the sophisticated organizational system known as the hexagrammaton. The hexagrammaton represented 6 specialized wings within the Legion, each dedicated to a particular form of warfare, and each maintaining its own tactical doctrines, equipment preferences, and training regimens. This structure allowed the Dark Angels to deploy forces specifically tailored to any combat situation, drawing on specialists who had spent decades perfecting their particular methods of war. The system created a legion that could fight as a unified whole or as independent elements, each wing capable of operating autonomously while still contributing to the larger strategic picture. The Death Wing formed the first of these wings, comprising the Legion's Terminator armored veterans, who specialized in close-quarters combat and boarding actions. These warriors wore tactical dreadnought armor that could withstand punishment that would obliterate standard power armor, and they carried weapons designed to tear through the heaviest enemy formations. The Deathwing deployed in situations where absolute certainty of victory was required, where the target had to be eliminated regardless of cost or circumstance. The Dreadwing represented the Dark Angel's capacity for total warfare, the wing that carried and deployed weapons considered too terrible for regular use. Phosphex, rad weapons, vortex grenades, and other implements of mass destruction fell under the Dreadwing's purview. These warriors understood that some enemies could not be defeated through conventional means, that some threats required absolute eradication. The Dreadwing's existence reflected the Lion's willingness to use any tool necessary to achieve victory, a pragmatism that sometimes troubled even his own sons, but which had proven effective throughout the Great Crusade. The Firewing specialized in what later ages would call special operations, though the term failed to capture the full scope of their activities. Assassination, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the elimination of specific high-value targets formed the core of Firewing doctrine. These warriors operated in small units, often behind enemy lines, striking at command structures and infrastructure to create chaos and confusion that larger Dark Angels forces could exploit. The Ironwing controlled the Legion's armored assets, the tanks and heavy vehicles that provided mobile firepower and breakthrough capability. Ironwing doctrine emphasized the integration of Astartes infantry with mechanized units, creating combined arms formations that could overwhelm defensive positions or pursue retreating enemies with equal effectiveness. The Predator tanks, Land Raiders, and other armored vehicles under Ironwing command represented a significant portion of the Legion's destructive capability, and Ironwing commanders were experts at terrain analysis and the identification of optimal routes for armored advance. The Ravenwing served as the Legion's rapid response and reconnaissance force, mounted on bikes and speeders that allowed them to cover vast distances quickly. These warriors excelled at hit-and-run attacks, at gathering intelligence through aggressive scouting, and at exploiting gaps in enemy formations. The Ravenwing could strike deep into enemy territory, cause havoc, and withdraw before the enemy could mount an effective response. The Stormwing represented the most recently formalized of the 6 wings, though the tactical doctrines it embodied had been part of Dark Angel's warfare for decades. Stormwing forces specialized in airborne assault and drop pod operations, deploying from orbit directly into combat zones with overwhelming speed and violence. These warriors trained extensively in the disorienting moments immediately following planetfall, learning to fight effectively while still recovering from the brutal deceleration of atmospheric entry. The existence of these 6 wings meant that the Dark Angels entering Thramas could respond to virtually any tactical situation, with specialists trained specifically for those conditions. The system's flexibility would prove crucial in the grinding campaign that followed, as the Night Lords refused to offer the kind of conventional battle that might have allowed the Dark Angels to bring their full strength to bear in a single decisive engagement. The Night Lords' 8th Legion that the Dark Angels faced across the Thramas Sector represented a very different kind of military force. Where the 1st Legion embodied discipline and systematic warfare, the 8th had become something more chaotic and predatory. The Night Lords had always been brutal, had always relied on terror as a weapon, but the destruction of their homeworld Nostromo had severed whatever restraints had previously existed on their behavior. Nostromo had been a nightmare world of perpetual darkness and endemic crime, and it had produced recruits who understood fear and violence on an instinctive level. When Konrad Curze ordered the planet destroyed, declaring it too corrupt to be allowed to continue existing, he had eliminated the primary source of new recruits for his legion, but had also removed any connection his warriors might have felt to something beyond themselves and their Primarch. The Night Lords who fought at Thramas were untethered from any loyalty except to their own companies and to Curze himself, and even those bonds were fraying. The 8th Legion's organization had never been as formal or as rigid as that of the Dark Angels. Night Lords' forces typically operated in company strength units or smaller, each commanded by a captain who exercised near absolute authority over his warriors. These companies functioned as semi-independent raiding forces, coming together for major operations, but otherwise pursuing their own objectives within the broader strategic framework established by Curze and his senior commanders. This decentralized structure made the Night Lords extremely difficult to pin down or to predict, as there was no single command structure that could be disrupted to paralyze the entire Legion. Individual companies could be destroyed without significantly impacting the operational capability of the Legion as a whole, and the loss of even senior commanders rarely created the kind of organizational chaos that might cripple a more hierarchical force. The Night Lords' fleet composition reflected their operational doctrine. The 8th Legion maintained a large number of strike cruisers and smaller vessels, ships that could operate independently and that prioritized speed and stealth over raw firepower. These vessels could appear in a system, deploy raiding forces to a planetary surface, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The Night Lords rarely sought to hold territory in any conventional sense. Instead, they moved constantly, hitting targets across a wide area to create an impression of being everywhere at once. This approach to warfare made them exceptionally effective at the kind of terror campaign they were conducting in Thramas, but it also meant they struggled to concentrate their forces when faced with an enemy who could force them into direct confrontation. Sevatar commanded the Night Lords' Atramentor, the 1st company and the closest thing the 8th Legion had to an elite formation comparable to the Dark Angels' Deathwing. The 1st captain was a warrior whose reputation for violence was extreme even by the standards of his legion, and he served as Curze's primary enforcer, and the voice of something resembling reason when the Primarchs' madness became too severe for effective command. Sevatar understood that the Night Lords were fighting a war they could not win through conventional means, that their only hope of success lay in dragging the Dark Angels into the kind of grinding, vicious conflict that would bleed both legions white. The 1st captain's tactical acumen was considerable, and he worked to impose some degree of coordination on the various Night Lords companies operating throughout the Thramas Sector, though his success in this effort was limited by the fractious nature of the Legion's command structure. The Dark Angels deployed their own champions to counter the Night Lords' leadership. Alajos, known as the Crimson Lion, commanded significant elements of the 1st Legion's forces during the Thramas Crusade and earned a reputation as one of the Lion's most trusted subordinates. Alajos embodied the Dark Angels' approach to warfare, combining tactical precision with an absolute commitment to victory regardless of cost. The Crimson Lion understood that the Night Lords could not be allowed to dictate the terms of engagement, that the Dark Angels needed to force their enemies into battles where superior discipline and firepower could be brought to bear decisively. Other senior Dark Angels commanders brought their own expertise to the campaign, each drawing on decades of experience and on the specialized training of their respective wings within the hexagrammaton. The philosophical divide between the two legions ran deeper than simple differences in tactical doctrine. Lionel Johnson approached warfare as a problem to be solved through the application of superior strategy and overwhelming force. The Lion analyzed his enemies, identified their weaknesses, and struck with precision to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. This approach had served him well throughout the Great Crusade, allowing him to claim one of the highest tallies of compliant worlds among all the Primarchs. The Lion believed in victory through superiority, in demonstrating that resistance was futile because the Dark Angels were simply better at warfare than anyone they faced. There was an arrogance to this worldview, but it was an arrogance built on 2 centuries of consistent success. Konrad Curze operated according to a very different calculus. The Primarch of the Night Lords had been shaped by visions of the future that showed him atrocity and betrayal, that convinced him that humanity was fundamentally corrupt, and that only through fear could any semblance of order be maintained. Curze's approach to warfare was designed not simply to defeat enemies, but to break them psychologically, to create such terror that resistance became unthinkable. The Night Lords did not merely kill their enemies, they made examples of them, crafting atrocities that would be remembered and spoken of in whispers for generations. This was warfare as psychological operation, combat designed to achieve effects far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Curze believed that one sufficiently brutal example could prevent 100 future rebellions, that fear was the only reliable tool for controlling human behavior. The Primarch's prophetic visions complicated his command of the 8th Legion during the Thramas Crusade. Curze saw possible futures constantly, fragmentary glimpses of what might occur that often contradicted each other or presented information without sufficient context to be useful. These visions had driven him to the edge of madness even before the heresy began, and the stress of commanding a legion in combat against one of his brothers pushed him further toward complete psychological collapse. There were periods during the Thramas Crusade when Curze became nearly catatonic, lost in visions of futures that might never come to pass, leaving Sevatar and other senior commanders to direct the Legion's operations without guidance from their Primarch. Other times, Curze would emerge from his fugue states with specific tactical instructions based on what he had seen, demanding that his forces move to particular locations or strike specific targets for reasons he could not or would not explain. The contrast between the Lion's calculated approach and Curze's prophetic madness created a strange dynamic as the 2 legions clashed across the Thramas Sector. The Dark Angels fought according to established doctrine, deploying their specialized wings in coordinated operations designed to corner and destroy Night Lords' forces. The Night Lords responded with seemingly random attacks that nevertheless managed to disrupt Dark Angels' operations with disturbing frequency, as if Curze's visions allowed him to anticipate where the First Legion would be most vulnerable. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage in the opening months of the campaign, and what both Primarchs had expected to be a relatively brief confrontation began to transform into something far more protracted and costly. The Night Lords struck at the Thramas Sector with a calculated savagery that revealed the true nature of their campaign. The 8th Legion's initial raids targeted worlds that held minimal military value but maximum potential for psychological impact. Agri-worlds that fed entire subsectors found their populations subjected to methodical terror, with Night Lords' kill teams descending on farming communities and leaving displays of butchery that served no tactical purpose beyond spreading fear. Forge worlds on the sector's periphery discovered that their defense monitors and orbital stations could be infiltrated and sabotaged, their garrisons slaughtered in ways designed to maximize horror among the survivors. The pattern emerged quickly for any analyst examining the attacks. Konrad Curze was not attempting to conquer the Thramas Sector or to hold strategic positions. He was transforming it into a charnel house, creating a theater of atrocity that would force the Dark Angels to respond. The Forge world of Sheol received the Night Lord's attention early in the campaign. The planet's manufacturing complexes produced munitions and armor components for Imperial forces throughout the Eastern Fringe, making it a legitimate military target by any conventional assessment. The Night Lord's approach to neutralizing Sheol's production capacity, however, bore no resemblance to standard military doctrine. Rather than conducting orbital bombardment of the forge complexes or deploying forces to seize control of key facilities, the 8th Legion infiltrated the worker habitation blocks that surrounded the industrial zones. Over the course of 3 nights, Night Lord's kill teams moved through the hab blocks, selecting victims according to criteria that seemed arbitrary to outside observers, but which followed a logic comprehensible only to Curze and his captains. Entire families disappeared, their remains discovered days later, arranged in configurations that violated every human instinct about the proper treatment of the dead. The Forge World's Mechanicum overseers found themselves unable to maintain production schedules as their workforce collapsed into panic. Workers refused to leave secured areas, productivity plummeted, and the carefully calibrated systems that kept the forge complexes operating began to break down from simple neglect as trained personnel abandoned their posts. The Night Lords achieved complete disruption of Sheol's manufacturing capacity without destroying a single forge complex or killing more than a few thousand of the planet's population. The Vox transmissions that escaped Sheol before the Night Lords severed the planet's communications carried descriptions of the atrocities that spread fear to neighboring systems. Refugees who managed to flee in the handful of vessels that escaped the 8th Legion's blockade brought eyewitness accounts that grew more horrific with each retelling. Similar attacks unfolded across 24 worlds in the opening weeks of the campaign. The agri-world of Carphos lost 3 major population centers to Night Lords' raids that left the cities intact but empty. Their inhabitants vanished without trace until reconnaissance teams discovered mass graves outside the urban zones. The mining colonies of the Harrow Belt found their ore shipments disrupted not by the destruction of their facilities, but by the systematic elimination of the specialized workers who operated the extraction equipment. Each attack followed the same fundamental pattern. The Night Lords identified targets where relatively small numbers of casualties could create disproportionate psychological and economic effects, struck with overwhelming speed and brutality, and withdrew before significant resistance could be organized. The Vox networks throughout the Thramas Sector became weapons in Curze's psychological warfare campaign. Night Lord sorcerers and communications specialists hijacked civilian and military frequencies, broadcasting recordings of their attacks across entire planetary systems. The recordings were edited to maximize their impact, showing the worst moments of each raid in excruciating detail. Victim screams, the sounds of combat, and the cold voices of Night Lord's warriors describing what they were doing and why formed an audio landscape of horror that civilian populations found impossible to ignore. The broadcasts included messages directed specifically at Lionel Johnson, taunting the Dark Angel's Primarch for his failure to protect Imperial citizens, questioning his competence and his commitment to the Emperor's subjects. Konrad Curze appeared in some of these broadcasts personally, his gaunt features and black eyes filling picked screens across the sector as he spoke directly to the populations under attack. The Night Haunter, as he sometimes styled himself, explained in disturbing detail exactly what his legion intended to do to the Thramas Sector and why. Curze claimed that the atrocities were necessary demonstrations of the futility of resistance, that the Dark Angels could not protect everyone, and that cooperation with the Night Lords would result in swift deaths rather than prolonged suffering. The Primarchs' words carried a conviction that made them more disturbing than simple threats. Curze genuinely believed that what he was doing served a purpose, that terror was a tool of control more reliable than loyalty or faith. Lionel Johnson received reports of these attacks as his fleet entered the Thramas Sector, and the Primarch's response revealed both his tactical acumen and his limitations as a strategic commander. The Lion immediately recognized that the Night Lords were attempting to provoke him into hasty action, that Curze wanted the Dark Angels dispersed across multiple systems, responding to raids, rather than concentrated as a unified force. Understanding the enemy's intent, however, did not make it any easier to formulate an effective counter-strategy. The Dark Angels could not simply ignore the attacks and focus on locating the main Night Lord's fleet, as doing so would mean abandoning millions of Imperial citizens to torture and death. The First Legion's reputation and the Lion's own sense of honor made such a course of action impossible to contemplate seriously. The Lion established his primary operational base in the Diamat system, a heavily industrialized sector hub that possessed sufficient infrastructure to support a Legion-scale deployment. Diamat's orbital facilities could accommodate the Dark Angel's fleet, its forge complexes could provide resupply and repair services, and its position in the sector allowed relatively rapid response to multiple neighboring systems. The Dark Angels began fortifying Diamat immediately upon arrival, constructing additional defense platforms and establishing ground-based monitoring stations that could track warp translations throughout the surrounding systems. The First Legion's approach to the campaign reflected their Primarchs' preference for methodical preparation and the establishment of secure operational foundations before committing to offensive action. From Diamat, the Lion deployed Dark Angels forces in a pattern designed to create a network of rapid response capabilities across the most critical systems in the Thramas Sector. Rather than attempting to garrison every world or to chase after every Night Lord's raid, the Dark Angels established strong points in systems that controlled major warp routes or that possessed resources essential to the sector's continued function. These strong points consisted of company or battalion strength forces, often built around elements from specific hexagrammaton wings selected for their suitability to the local tactical situation. Forge worlds received Ironwing detachments whose armored formations could respond quickly to threats against industrial complexes. Critical warp route junctions were assigned Ravenwing forces capable of intercepting enemy ships attempting to transit through the system. The strategy aimed to force the Night Lords into a position where they could no longer strike at will without encountering significant Dark Angels resistance. If the 8th Legion wanted to continue their terror campaign, they would need to fight through or around Dark Angel's strong points, creating opportunities for the First Legion to bring their superior firepower and discipline to bear in decisive engagements. The Lion calculated that once he could force the Night Lords into several major battles and inflict significant casualties, Curze would be compelled to either withdraw from the sector entirely or to concentrate his forces for a conventional campaign that would play to the Dark Angel's strengths. The early engagements between the two legions demonstrated that both sides understood they were facing opponents of exceptional capability. The first significant clash occurred in the Galatian system when a Dark Angel's Ravenwing force intercepted a Night Lord's company attempting to raid the system's primary hive world. The Ravenwing squadron, consisting of approximately 200 mounted Astartes supported by land speeders and light armor, caught the Night Lord's force during its withdrawal to orbit after completing its ground operations. The engagement that followed lasted less than an hour, but revealed much about how the campaign would unfold. The Night Lord's company, commanded by a captain whose name was recorded as Ophion in Dark Angels after action reports, demonstrated the 8th Legion's characteristic preference for ambush and sudden violence. Rather than attempting to fight through the Ravenwing force to reach their extraction point, the Night Lords scattered into the Hive City's undercity warrens, forcing the Dark Angels to pursue them through terrain that negated the advantages of mounted warfare. The Ravenwing forces dismounted and followed, and the fighting devolved into a brutal close-quarters battle through kilometers of maintenance tunnels and abandoned habitation zones. Both sides took casualties, though neither sustained losses sufficient to significantly impact their operational capability. The Night Lords eventually reached their extraction point and withdrew, but they were forced to abandon significant amounts of equipment and leave behind their wounded. The Galatian engagement established patterns that would repeat throughout the Thramas Crusade. The Night Lords proved exceptionally skilled at breaking contact when faced with superior forces, using their knowledge of terrain and their willingness to abandon objectives to avoid decisive engagement. The Dark Angels, conversely, demonstrated their ability to respond rapidly to Night Lords' attacks and to inflict casualties even when unable to prevent the enemy's ultimate withdrawal. Neither side could claim clear victory in these early skirmishes, but both learned valuable lessons about their opponent's capabilities and limitations. Firewing elements began conducting their own operations as the campaign progressed, attempting to identify Night Lord's command structures and logistics networks that could be targeted for elimination. The Firewing's approach to warfare emphasized intelligence gathering and precision strikes against high-value targets, making them theoretically well-suited to countering an enemy who refused conventional battle. The reality proved more complicated than Dark Angel's planning had anticipated. The Night Lord's decentralized command structure meant that there were few single points of failure that could be exploited. Individual captains commanded their companies with near total autonomy, and the elimination of even several senior commanders rarely created significant disruption to the Legion's overall operations. One Firewing operation targeted a Night Lord's supply depot on the moon of Kemet, a facility that intelligence suggested served as a major logistics hub for 8th Legion operations in the sector's northern regions. The Firewing team infiltrated the facility, eliminated its defenders, and destroyed several months' worth of supplies and ammunition. The operation was executed flawlessly by any conventional assessment, yet its strategic impact proved minimal. The Night Lords simply shifted their logistics operations to other locations, drawing on supplies cached throughout the sector in anticipation of exactly this kind of disruption. The 8th Legion's approach to supply and logistics was as decentralized as their command structure, making them frustratingly resilient to the kind of targeted strikes that had proven effective against more conventionally organized enemies during the Great Crusade. The psychological warfare campaign intensified as the Dark Angels established their presence in the sector. Curze's broadcasts became more frequent and more specifically targeted at provoking Lionel Johnson into rash action. The Night Haunter spoke of the Lion's failures, of worlds burning while the Dark Angels sat in their fortified positions, of innocent citizens dying because the First Legion's Primarch was too cautious or too incompetent to stop it. The broadcasts included picked captures of atrocities conducted specifically for the purpose of enraging the Lion, displays of cruelty that served no military purpose beyond their psychological impact. Curze seemed to understand exactly which provocations would be most effective, which accusations would cut deepest, as if his visions showed him not just possible futures, but also the inner workings of his brother's mind. The Lion's response to these provocations remained measured, at least in his public actions and orders to his legion. The Dark Angel's Primarch refused to be drawn into the kind of dispersed, reactive campaign that Curze clearly wanted to provoke. Yet those who served closest to the Lion during this period reported signs of strain that suggested the psychological warfare was having its intended effect. The Primarch became more withdrawn, spending long hours in solitary analysis of tactical data and intelligence reports, searching for patterns that might reveal where Curze would strike next, or where the Night Lord's main fleet was hiding. The Lion's temper, normally kept under rigid control, began to show itself in brief flashes of anger directed at subordinates who failed to meet his exacting standards, or who brought him reports of yet another successful Night Lord's raid. The opening phase of the Thramas Crusade established the fundamental dynamic that would define the next 3 years of conflict. The Night Lords would strike across a wide front, targeting civilian populations and economic infrastructure to create terror and to force the Dark Angels to respond. The Dark Angels would attempt to corner and destroy Night Lords' forces through superior coordination and firepower, only to find their enemies melting away before decisive engagement could be achieved. Both legions would bleed slowly, losing warriors and ships in skirmishes and ambushes that individually meant little, but which cumulatively represented a significant drain on their strength. Neither Primarch achieved their initial objectives in these opening months, and both began to realize that the conflict they had entered would not be resolved as quickly or as cleanly as they had anticipated. The Void War that unfolded across the Thramas Sector represented a dimension of the conflict that proved as critical as the ground campaigns and terror raids that drew more immediate attention. control of orbital space determined which side could deploy forces to planetary surfaces, which supply convoys could reach their destinations, and ultimately which legion could sustain its operations across the vast distances of the sector. The Dark Angels entered this naval campaign with significant advantages in terms of fleet strength and capital ship firepower, but the Night Lords possessed their own capabilities that allowed them to contest the void despite their numerical inferiority. The Dark Angels fleet that Lyon L. Johnson commanded from his flagship, the Invincible Reason, represented one of the most powerful naval forces assembled by any single legion during the Great Crusade. The Invincible Reason itself was a Gloriana-class battleship, a vessel type that only the Primarchs and the most senior Imperial commanders possessed. These massive warships measured over 20 kilometers in length and carried armament sufficient to reduce entire fleets to debris. The Invincible Reason's weapons batteries could engage targets at extreme range with devastating accuracy, while its armor plating could withstand punishment that would cripple lesser vessels. The ship served not merely as the Lion's mobile headquarters, but as a symbol of the Dark Angel's power and a strategic asset whose presence in a system could determine the outcome of an engagement before the first shots were fired. Beyond the Invincible Reason, the Dark Angel's fleet included dozens of battle barges, each capable of serving as a command ship for major operations and carrying sufficient firepower to engage multiple enemy vessels simultaneously. These ships were purpose-built for space marine operations, combining the ability to deploy thousands of astartes to planetary surfaces with the armament necessary to achieve and maintain orbital superiority. The Dark Angel's battle barges bore names that reflected the Legion's history and its connection to Caliban: the Invincible, the Flamebringer, the Unforgiving. Each had served throughout the Great Crusade, their crews developing expertise in void warfare that matched the ground combat skills of the astartes they transported. Strike cruisers formed the backbone of the Dark Angel's fleet's operational capability, numbering in the hundreds, and providing the mobility necessary to respond to threats across multiple systems simultaneously. These vessels were smaller and faster than battle barges, sacrificing some firepower and troop capacity for improved speed and maneuverability. Strike cruisers could operate independently or in squadrons, conducting patrols along warp routes, escorting supply convoys, or deploying rapid response forces to systems under attack. The Dark Angels maintained their strike cruisers to exacting standards, with regular maintenance cycles and crew training that ensured consistent performance even after months of continuous operations. The fleet's supporting elements included numerous escort vessels, destroyers, and frigates that provided screening for larger ships and conducted reconnaissance operations. These smaller vessels lacked the firepower to engage capital ships directly, but they excelled at intercepting enemy raiders, detecting incoming threats, and providing early warning of enemy fleet movements. The Dark Angel's approach to fleet organization emphasized coordination between vessel types, with each ship type assigned specific roles within the larger battle plan and crews trained to execute their assigned tasks with precision. The Night Lord's fleet presented a stark contrast in both composition and operational doctrine. The 8th Legion maintained fewer capital ships than the Dark Angels, and those they possessed were often older vessels that had seen hard service during the Great Crusade without receiving the same level of maintenance and upgrade that the 1st Legion's ships enjoyed. What the Night Lords lacked in raw firepower, however, they compensated for through superior knowledge of the Thramas Sector's warp routes and a willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders would reject as suicidal. Konrad Curze commanded from the Nightfall, a vessel that defied easy classification within standard Imperial naval architecture. The Nightfall had begun its existence as a standard battleship, but decades of modification and expansion had transformed it into something unique. The ship's exterior bristled with sensor arrays and communications equipment that allowed Curze to coordinate his scattered forces across vast distances. The interior had been modified to reflect the Night Lord's aesthetic preferences, with entire sections maintained in near-total darkness and decorated with trophies taken from victims across 2 centuries of terror campaigns. The Nightfall's armament remained formidable despite its age, and its engines had been upgraded to provide acceleration that matched vessels half its size. The Night Lord's fleet emphasized strike cruisers and smaller vessels over the kind of capital ship strength that the Dark Angels deployed. This composition reflected the 8th Legion's operational doctrine, which prioritized speed and the ability to strike across a wide front over concentrated firepower. Night Lord strike cruisers operated independently or in small squadrons, appearing in systems to deploy raiding forces before withdrawing ahead of enemy reinforcements. These vessels were maintained in a state that prioritized functionality over appearance, their hulls often bearing scars from previous engagements that had never been properly repaired. The crews that operated Night Lord's vessels were drawn from the same population that supplied the Legion's Astartes, and they shared their master's comfort with operating in conditions that would drive other Imperial personnel to desertion or madness. The tactical advantages that the Night Lords possessed in void warfare stemmed primarily from their superior understanding of the Thramas Sector's warp geography. The 8th Legion had arrived in the sector months before the Dark Angels, and had used that time to conduct extensive surveys of local warp routes, identifying stable corridors, dangerous regions where the barrier between real space and the immaterium grew thin, and hidden approaches that did not appear on standard Imperial navigational charts. This knowledge allowed Night Lord's vessels to appear in systems through unexpected vectors, to withdraw along routes that pursuing Dark Angel ships could not safely follow, and to maintain supply lines that should have been impossible to sustain given the sector's strategic situation. The Night Lord's navigators played a crucial role in enabling this mobility. The 8th Legion maintained a cadre of navigators who specialized in finding routes through regions of the warp that standard doctrine classified as too dangerous for transit. These navigators accepted risks that their counterparts serving other legions would reject, gambling that their skills and their ship speed would allow them to survive passages through warp storms and unstable corridors that could tear vessels apart or strand them in the immaterium for subjective centuries. The casualty rate among Night Lord's navigators was significantly higher than the Imperial average, but those who survived developed an almost instinctive understanding of the local warp's patterns and behaviors. The first major fleet engagement of the Thramas Crusade occurred in the Sheol system, approximately 6 weeks after the Dark Angels established their presence in the sector. A Dark Angels battle group consisting of 3 battle barges and supporting vessels had deployed to Sheol to assess the damage from the earlier Night Lord's raid and to establish an orbital garrison that could prevent future attacks. The Night Lord squadron that intercepted this battle group emerged from the warp dangerously close to the planet, having used a route through the immaterium that standard Imperial doctrine would have classified as impassable. The sudden appearance of enemy vessels at close range negated many of the advantages that the Dark Angel's superior firepower should have provided, as the engagement began at distances where even escort vessels could bring their weapons to bear effectively. The engagement lasted 17 hours and demonstrated both the Dark Angel's disciplined approach to void warfare and the Night Lord's capacity for causing chaos through aggressive tactics. The Dark Angel's battle group maintained formation throughout the engagement, with each vessel supporting its companions and concentrating fire on priority targets according to pre-established doctrine. The Night Lord squadron, conversely, operated as a collection of individual vessels whose captains made their own tactical decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than adherence to an overall battle plan. This approach created situations where Night Lord's vessels would break off from apparently winning engagements to pursue other targets, or where they would concentrate overwhelming force against a single Dark Angel ship before scattering when reinforcements arrived. The engagement concluded when the Night Lord squadron withdrew, having inflicted damage on 2 of the 3 Dark Angels battle barges, but having lost one of their own strike cruisers to concentrated fire from the Invincible. Neither side could claim decisive victory, though both had demonstrated capabilities that would influence subsequent engagements. The Dark Angels proved that their superior firepower and coordination could destroy Night Lord's vessels when they could be brought to battle, while the Night Lords showed that they could choose when and where to engage and could withdraw before suffering catastrophic losses. Lionel Johnson responded to the Sheol engagement by restructuring his fleet deployment patterns. Rather than maintaining large battle groups in static positions, the Lion organized his fleet into hunting packs designed to pursue and corner Night Lord squadrons. These hunting packs typically consisted of a battle barge or heavy cruiser supported by multiple strike cruisers and escort vessels, providing sufficient firepower to engage any Night Lord's force while maintaining the speed necessary to pursue fleeing enemies. The Dark Angels established patrol patterns along major warp routes, attempting to predict where Night Lord's vessels would appear and to position forces to intercept them. The Night Lords adapted to this new deployment pattern by further dispersing their fleet and by increasing their use of unconventional warp routes. Rather than maintaining any kind of predictable patrol or raiding schedule, Night Lord squadrons would disappear into the warp for weeks at a time, emerging in systems that the Dark Angels had classified as low-priority targets or that seemed to possess no strategic value. These raids often targeted supply convoys or isolated outposts rather than major installations, inflicting economic damage and forcing the Dark Angels to spread their fleet even more thinly to protect potential targets. The contest for control of supply lines became a critical aspect of the Void War as the campaign extended beyond its initial months. Both legions required constant resupply of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and other materiel to maintain their operations. The Dark Angels established a supply network that connected Diamat to other major strongholds throughout the sector, with heavily escorted convoys making regular runs along protected routes. These convoys became priority targets for Night Lord's raiders, who recognized that disrupting the Dark Angels' logistics would be more effective than attempting to engage their main fleet in direct combat. The convoy battles that resulted from Night Lord's attacks on Dark Angels' supply lines followed predictable patterns. The Dark Angels would assign escort forces to each convoy, typically consisting of several strike cruisers and numerous escort vessels. The Night Lords would attempt to identify weak points in the convoy's defenses or to catch convoys during the vulnerable period when they were translating from the warp into real space. The engagements were usually brief and vicious, with the Night Lords attempting to destroy as many transport vessels as possible before the convoy's escorts could drive them off. The Dark Angels' escort forces became increasingly effective at protecting their charges as the campaign progressed, developing tactics specifically designed to counter Night Lords' hit-and-run attacks, but losses remained significant enough to create supply shortages in some Dark Angel strongholds. The Night Lords faced their own supply challenges that proved more severe than those confronting the Dark Angels. The 8th Legion had no equivalent to Diamat, no major stronghold where they could establish repair facilities and supply depots. Instead, the Night Lords maintained numerous small caches scattered throughout the sector, often hidden on moons or asteroids that possessed no other strategic value. This dispersed approach to logistics made the Night Lords less vulnerable to the kind of targeted strikes that could cripple a more centralized supply network, but it also meant that individual squadrons sometimes found themselves operating without adequate supplies of critical materiel. Night Lords' vessels developed a reputation for aggressive scavenging, stripping destroyed ships of anything useful and conducting raids specifically to capture supplies rather than to inflict casualties or spread terror. The technological sophistication of both Legion's vessels played a significant role in determining engagement outcomes. Dark Angel's ships mounted advanced targeting systems and fire control equipment that allowed them to engage enemies at extreme range with accuracy that few other Imperial forces could match. The crews that operated these systems had trained for decades in their use, developing an almost instinctive understanding of how to compensate for target movement and how to concentrate fire for maximum effect. Night Lords' vessels, while generally less well equipped than their Dark Angels' counterparts, compensated through the aggressive use of electronic warfare and sensor jamming. Night Lords' ships would often approach targets while broadcasting false sensor returns or while operating in complete emission silence, techniques that allowed them to close to engagement range before their enemies could accurately determine their positions and vectors. The presence of the invincible reason in any engagement significantly altered the tactical situation in favor of the Dark Angels. The Gloriana-class battleship possessed firepower sufficient to engage multiple enemy capital ships simultaneously, and its armor could withstand damage that would destroy lesser vessels. The Lion used his flagship sparingly during the early stages of the campaign, recognizing that its loss would represent both a strategic catastrophe and a severe blow to Dark Angel's morale. When the invincible reason did deploy to combat zones, it typically served as the anchor for major fleet actions, rather than participating in the kind of patrol and escort duties that occupied most of the Dark Angel's fleet. The Void War's grinding nature began to tell on both legions as the campaign extended into its second year. The Dark Angels lost dozens of vessels to Night Lord's attacks, with losses concentrated among the escort and strike cruiser classes that bore the burden of patrol and convoy escort duties. These losses were sustainable in terms of overall fleet strength, but they represented the elimination of experienced crews whose expertise could not be easily replaced. The Night Lords suffered proportionally higher losses, with their smaller fleet less able to absorb the destruction of individual vessels. Several Night Lords companies found themselves effectively grounded when the strike cruisers that transported them were destroyed, forcing these companies to operate exclusively on planetary surfaces or to crowd onto other vessels that were already operating at capacity. The planetary warfare that consumed the Thramas Sector revealed the full horror of what occurred when two legions committed to total war against each other, with no constraints beyond their own tactical requirements. The Void War determined which side could deploy forces and maintain supply lines, but the ground campaigns decided the fate of billions of Imperial citizens and transformed entire worlds into monuments to the heresy's brutality. The Night Lords approached planetary warfare as an extension of their terror doctrine, viewing civilian populations not as collateral concerns, but as primary targets whose suffering would force the Dark Angels into disadvantageous positions. The Dark Angels responded with increasing ruthlessness as the campaign progressed, deploying weapons and tactics that they had previously reserved for Xeno's enemies, judged too dangerous to be allowed any possibility of survival. The hive world of Kartas became the site of one of the first major ground engagements between the two legions. Kartas maintained a population of 17 billion distributed across 3 massive hive cities and dozens of smaller urban centers. The world's industrial output supplied finished goods to neighboring systems, and its position along a major warp route made it strategically valuable beyond its economic contribution. Night Lord's forces had conducted several raids against Kartas during the campaign's opening months, each time withdrawing before Dark Angel's reinforcements could arrive. The pattern changed when a full Night Lord's battle company, approximately 800 Astartes supported by armor and artillery, deployed to the primary hive city of Kartas Prime and fortified positions in the Underhive, rather than conducting their usual hit-and-run attack. The Dark Angel's response force consisted of elements from multiple wings of the Hexagrammaton, reflecting the tactical complexity of urban warfare against an entrenched enemy. Deathwing Terminators would lead assaults on hardened positions, where their tactical dreadnought armor could withstand the concentrated fire that would shred standard power armor. Firewing kill teams infiltrated the hive city ahead of the main assault, gathering intelligence on Night Lord's positions and eliminating isolated enemy units. The Ironwing contributed armored formations that could provide mobile fire support in the hive's wider transit corridors, while Ravenwing elements established a perimeter to prevent Night Lord's forces from escaping into the surrounding wasteland. The battle for Kartas Prime lasted 11 weeks and demonstrated how the fundamental differences between the two legions translated into ground combat doctrine. The Dark Angels approached the engagement methodically, clearing the hive level by level and establishing secure zones before advancing to the next objective. Deathwing assault teams would breach Night Lord's positions with overwhelming firepower, supported by heavy weapons teams that provided suppressing fire from prepared positions. The Dark Angels established field hospitals, supply depots, and command posts as they advanced, creating a logistics network that allowed them to sustain operations indefinitely. This approach prioritized minimizing Dark Angels' casualties over speed of advance, accepting that the operation would take weeks or months if necessary to achieve complete victory with acceptable losses. The Night Lords defended Karta's Prime through a combination of conventional ambush tactics and psychological warfare designed to erode Dark Angels' morale and cohesion. Rather than holding fixed positions until overrun, Night Lord squads would engage Dark Angels' forces briefly before withdrawing through the Hive's maze of passages and ventilation systems. The 8th Legion had spent weeks preparing the battlefield before the Dark Angels arrived, placing traps, establishing fallback positions, and identifying routes that would allow them to strike at their enemies from unexpected angles. Night Lords' positions were often booby-trapped, so that even successful Dark Angels' assaults would result in casualties from explosives or toxins left behind by the defenders. The civilian population of Karta's Prime became weapons in the Night Lords' defensive strategy. The 8th Legion herded thousands of civilians into areas where Dark Angels' forces would encounter them, creating situations where the 1st Legion had to choose between accepting delays to evacuate non-combatants or advancing through crowds of terrified refugees. The Night Lords positioned snipers and heavy weapons teams among civilian populations, forcing Dark Angels units to either accept fire from these positions or to return fire with the certainty of causing massive civilian casualties. Some Night Lord squads wore flayed skin over their armor, displaying the faces of their victims in ways calculated to provoke emotional responses from their enemies. The Dark Angels' response to these tactics evolved as the battle progressed. Initial operations attempted to minimize civilian casualties, even at the cost of operational efficiency, with Dark Angels' forces spending precious time evacuating non-combatants from combat zones before engaging Night Lords' positions. The 8th Legion exploited these humanitarian concerns ruthlessly, using the delays created by evacuation operations to reposition forces or to prepare ambushes. After several Dark Angel squads were destroyed when they paused to assist civilians who turned out to be concealing Night Lords' ambush teams, orders came down from the command level to prioritize military objectives over civilian safety. The change in rules of engagement resulted in significantly higher civilian casualties, but allowed Dark Angels' forces to maintain operational momentum. The Dreadwing's deployment to Karta's Prime marked a turning point in the battle and demonstrated the Dark Angels' willingness to use weapons that violated the conventional rules of warfare. The Dreadwing specialized in the deployment of phosphex, rad weapons, and other instruments of mass destruction that the Imperium maintained for use against enemies judged too dangerous to be defeated through conventional means. On Karta's Prime, Dreadwing units deployed rad phage weapons in sections of the Underhive where Night Lords' resistance was particularly entrenched. These weapons released radiation that killed through cellular destruction, turning living tissue necrotic within hours of exposure. The rad phage contamination rendered entire sections of the Hive uninhabitable, killing not only the Night Lords' defenders, but also any civilians who remained in the affected zones. The use of rad weapons on Karta's Prime generated significant debate within the Dark Angels' command structure. Some officers argued that deploying such weapons against fellow Astartes, even traitors, represented a moral line that should not be crossed. Others pointed out that the Night Lords had already demonstrated their willingness to use any tactic that provided tactical advantage, and that the Dark Angels could not afford to handicap themselves with restrictions their enemies did not observe. Lionel Johnson settled the debate by authorizing Dreadwing deployment with minimal restrictions, making clear that victory took precedence over concerns about the methods used to achieve it. The Lion's decision reflected his pragmatic approach to warfare and his recognition that the Thramas Crusade had become a conflict where conventional restraints no longer applied. The Night Lords eventually withdrew from Karta's Prime after sustaining casualties that made continued defense untenable. The battle company that had initially fortified positions in the Hive had been reduced to fewer than 300 effective combatants, with their armor and heavy weapons largely destroyed or abandoned. The Dark Angels secured the Hive City, but at a cost of nearly 400 Astartes killed and twice that number wounded seriously enough to require extended recovery periods. The civilian death toll exceeded 2 million, with entire hab blocks depopulated by the fighting or by the rad phage contamination that would persist for decades after the battle's conclusion. The Forge world of Samarkand represented a target of genuine strategic value that both legions recognized as worth significant investment of resources to control or deny to their enemies. Samarkand's manufactorums produced plasma weapons, power armor components, and the sophisticated targeting systems that Dark Angels' vessels required to maintain their effectiveness in void combat. The Forge world's Mechanicum priesthood had maintained strict neutrality during the heresy's opening stages, continuing to fulfill contracts for both loyalist and traitor forces according to agreements that predated the Civil War. This neutrality became untenable when Night Lord's forces arrived in the Samarkand system and demanded exclusive access to the Forge world's output. The Mechanicum's refusal to comply with Night Lord's demands resulted in a siege that lasted for 8 months, and that demonstrated the 8th Legion's capacity for sustained conventional operations when their strategic situation required it. The Night Lords deployed approximately 3,000 Astartes to Samarkand, a force commitment that represented a significant portion of their available ground forces in the Thramas Sector. Rather than conducting their usual terror raids, the 8th Legion established siege lines around Samarkand's primary forge complex and began systematic reduction of the facility's defenses. The Night Lords brought heavy artillery to bear on the forge complex's void shields, maintaining constant bombardment that forced the defenders to divert power from manufacturing operations to maintain their protective barriers. The Dark Angels relief force that arrived at Samarkand 6 weeks into the siege consisted of nearly 5,000 Astartes, including significant Dreadwing and Ironwing elements. The Lion had recognized that Samarkand's loss would severely impact the Dark Angels' ability to maintain their fleet and armor in operational condition, making the Forge world's defense a strategic priority that justified major force commitment. The Dark Angels approached the relief operation as a set-piece battle, deploying their forces in a coordinated assault designed to break the Night Lord's siege lines through overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority. The battle for Samarkand demonstrated both legions operating at something approaching their full capability, with neither side able to rely on the advantages that had characterized earlier engagements. The Night Lords could not simply withdraw when faced with superior forces, as doing so would mean abandoning their siege and accepting that the months invested in reducing the Forge complex's defenses had been wasted. The Dark Angels could not employ the kind of methodical advance that had proven effective on Carda's Prime, as the Night Lord's siege lines were too extensive to be cleared section by section before the defenders could reposition. The result was a grinding battle of attrition where both sides committed their forces to direct confrontation with minimal room for tactical maneuvering. Ironwing armor formations spearheaded the Dark Angels' assault, with columns of Predator tanks and Land Raiders advancing under cover of artillery bombardment. The Night Lords had prepared anti-armor positions throughout their siege lines, with las cannon teams and missile launchers positioned to create killing zones, where Dark Angels vehicles would be exposed to fire from multiple angles. The armored assault succeeded in breaching the Night Lord's perimeter in several locations, but the cost in destroyed vehicles was severe enough that Ironwing commanders had to rotate damaged units out of the line and commit reserve formations earlier than planned. Deathwing Terminators deployed directly into Night Lord's rear areas via teleportation, appearing behind enemy lines to attack command posts and artillery positions. This tactic achieved significant initial success, with several Deathwing squads destroying Night Lord's heavy weapons and disrupting the coordination of the siege lines. The Night Lords adapted quickly, however, establishing kill zones around their critical positions and concentrating forces to overwhelm isolated Deathwing squads before they could withdraw or receive reinforcement. The teleportation assault resulted in the destruction of 3 entire Deathwing squads, casualties that represented a significant loss of veteran warriors whose tactical dreadnought armor and centuries of experience could not be easily replaced. The Siege of Samarkand concluded when the Night Lords withdrew from the planet entirely, recognizing that continued engagement would result in the destruction of their entire force without achieving their objective of capturing the Forge complex. The Dark Angels secured Samarkand and its manufacturing facilities, but the Forge world's production capacity had been severely damaged by months of bombardment. The Mechanicum priesthood estimated that restoring full operational capability would require at least 2 years, time that the Thramas Crusade would not allow. The battle's casualty figures reflected its intensity, with the Dark Angels losing nearly 800 Astartes killed and the Night Lords suffering casualties estimated at over 1,000. The agri-world of Perditus illustrated the terror tactics that the Night Lords employed when not constrained by specific military objectives. Perditus maintained no significant military installations and possessed minimal strategic value beyond its agricultural output. The world's population of 30 million lived in distributed farming communities that supplied food to neighboring systems. A Night Lord's raiding force of approximately 200 Astartes deployed to Perditus and spent 3 months conducting what could only be described as a systematic campaign of atrocity against the civilian population. The Night Lords on Perditus made no attempt to destroy infrastructure or to disrupt agricultural production. Instead, they selected communities apparently at random and subjected them to elaborately staged massacres designed to create maximum psychological impact on survivors. Entire villages would be depopulated overnight, their inhabitants' remains discovered arranged in configurations that served no purpose beyond demonstrating the Night Lords' contempt for human life and dignity. The 8th Legion broadcast recordings of their activities across the planet's Vox networks, ensuring that every community knew what was happening and that nowhere was safe from the raiders' attention. The Dark Angels' response to Perditus demonstrated the limitations of their strategic approach when facing an enemy who prioritized terror over military objectives. A Ravenwing force deployed to the agri-world and spent weeks hunting the Night Lords' raiders through Perditus's agricultural zones. The Night Lords refused direct engagement, withdrawing whenever Dark Angels' forces approached and resuming their terror campaign in different regions once the Ravenwing moved on. The pursuit consumed resources and tied down Dark Angels' forces that were needed elsewhere in the sector, achieving exactly the result that the Night Lords intended. The raiders eventually withdrew from Perditus after accomplishing their mission of spreading terror and forcing the Dark Angels to commit forces to protecting a world of minimal strategic value. The world of Thramas itself became the campaign's symbolic and strategic focal point during the Crusade's second year. Thramas was the sector capital, maintaining the administrative infrastructure that coordinated Imperial governance across dozens of systems. The planet hosted a population of 8 billion concentrated in several major urban centers, and its orbital facilities included shipyards capable of constructing and repairing capital-class vessels. Control of Thramas would provide significant advantages to whichever legion could secure it, making the world an inevitable flashpoint for major operations by both sides. The Night Lords arrived at Thramas in force, committing nearly half their available ground forces to an assault on the planet's primary hive city. The attack came without warning, with Night Lords vessels translating from the warp directly into low orbit and deploying their forces before the system's defenses could respond effectively. The 8th Legion's assault forces bypassed the Hive City's military garrison and defensive positions, instead deploying directly into civilian sectors, where their presence would create maximum chaos, and where the defenders would be unable to use their heavy weapons without causing massive collateral damage. The Dark Angels' response to the attack on Thramas required the Lion to make difficult decisions about force allocation and strategic priorities. Committing sufficient forces to retake Thramas would mean weakening Dark Angels' positions throughout the rest of the sector, potentially allowing the Night Lords to achieve victories elsewhere that would offset any gains made on the sector capital. Allowing Thramas to fall, however, would represent both a strategic defeat and a propaganda victory for the traitors that could undermine Imperial morale throughout the eastern fringe. The Lion chose to commit major forces to Thramas' liberation, deploying nearly 10,000 Astartes in what would become the largest single battle of the Thramas Crusade. The battle for Thramas lasted for 4 months and consumed both legions' attention to the exclusion of nearly all other operations in the sector. The fighting spread across the entire Hive city and into the surrounding industrial zones, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage despite repeated major offensives. The Dreadwing deployed Phosphex weapons in sections of the Hive where Night Lord's resistance proved impossible to overcome through conventional assault, creating firestorms that consumed entire city blocks and killed tens of thousands of civilians, along with the enemy defenders. The Night Lords responded by intensifying their terror tactics, conducting massacres specifically designed to provoke Dark Angel's forces into rash attacks that could be ambushed and destroyed. The relationship between Konrad Curze and Lionel Johnson had been complicated long before the Thramas Crusade forced them into direct confrontation. Both Primarchs had grown up in isolation from the Emperor and their brothers. Both had been shaped by worlds that taught them harsh lessons about survival and the nature of humanity, and both had developed approaches to warfare that set them apart from many of their siblings. Yet the similarities ended there, replaced by fundamental differences in philosophy and temperament that made genuine understanding between them impossible. The Lion had been raised in the monster-haunted forests of Caliban, learning to hunt creatures that could tear apart armored knights with ease, developing patience and tactical acumen through years of tracking prey that was faster and stronger than any human. Curze had clawed his way to dominance in the perpetual darkness of Nostromo's Hive cities, surrounded by criminals and predators who understood only violence and fear, his prophetic visions showing him futures filled with betrayal and atrocity. During the Great Crusade, the two Primarchs had worked together on several campaigns where their legion's capabilities complemented each other. The Dark Angels would engage enemy forces in conventional battle, pinning them in place and grinding down their resistance through superior firepower and discipline. The Night Lords would strike at supply lines and command structures, spreading terror through enemy rear areas and causing psychological collapse that made the Dark Angels' task easier. These joint operations had been successful by any objective measure, with compliant worlds brought into the Imperium and enemy forces destroyed with acceptable casualties. The working relationship between the two Primarchs during these campaigns had been professional but never warm, characterized by mutual respect for each other's military capabilities rather than any genuine affection or understanding. The fundamental ideological divide between them had been apparent even during these periods of cooperation. Lionel Johnson believed in the Imperium's mission, in the idea that humanity could be unified and elevated through the Emperor's vision of secular enlightenment and technological progress. The Lion saw warfare as a means to an end, a necessary tool for bringing order to a chaotic galaxy. Victory was important not for its own sake, but because it advanced the cause of human unity and prosperity. The methods used to achieve victory mattered to the Lion, not from any sentimental attachment to abstract moral principles, but because he understood that how wars were won determined what kind of peace would follow. Populations that submitted willingly or that were defeated cleanly could be integrated into the Imperium and made productive. Populations that were terrorized into submission remained problems that required constant military oversight to prevent rebellion. Konrad Curze operated according to a completely different calculus. The Night Haunter, as he often styled himself, had concluded through his visions and his experiences on Nostromo that humanity was fundamentally corrupt and that only through fear could any semblance of order be maintained. Curze believed that given the opportunity, humans would inevitably choose cruelty and selfishness over cooperation and virtue. His prophetic visions had shown him the worst aspects of human nature played out across countless possible futures, reinforcing his conviction that terror was not merely a tactical tool, but the only reliable method of social control. The Night Lord's brutal methods were not aberrations or necessary evils in Curze's worldview, but rather honest acknowledgments of reality. By making examples of criminals and rebels, by demonstrating the consequences of defiance in the most graphic terms possible, Curze believed he was actually minimizing overall suffering by preventing future transgressions. The Primarch of the Night Lords had been cursed with visions of the future since his earliest memories on Nostromo. These visions came unbidden, fragmentary glimpses of events that might occur, possibilities rather than certainties, but presented with such clarity that distinguishing between prophetic revelation and current reality became increasingly difficult. Curze had seen his own death countless times, experienced the moment of his assassination from multiple perspectives and in various circumstances. The visions showed him killed by an assassin on a dark world, murdered by one of his own sons, dying in battle against his brothers, executed by the Emperor himself. The details varied, but the fundamental fact remained consistent across nearly all the visions. Konrad Curze was going to die, and his death would come at the hands of those he had served or those he had created. These prophetic visions of his own mortality had driven Curze toward a nihilistic acceptance of damnation that colored every decision he made during the Thramas Crusade. If the future was fixed, if his death was inevitable regardless of his choices, then conventional concerns about victory or defeat became meaningless. Curze fought not to win in any conventional sense, but to validate his worldview, to demonstrate that his understanding of human nature was correct even as the galaxy burned around him. The Night Lord's terror tactics during the Thramas Crusade served this psychological need as much as any military objective. Every atrocity proved that humanity deserved the horrors being inflicted upon it. Every act of brutality confirmed that fear was the only reliable tool for controlling human behavior. The visions influenced Curze's tactical decisions in ways that often seemed incomprehensible to outside observers, and sometimes even to his own commanders. The Night Haunter would order forces move to specific locations based on glimpses of possible futures, would demand that particular targets be struck or particular enemies be killed for reasons he could not or would not explain. Sometimes these prophetically guided decisions resulted in significant tactical victories, with Night Lord's forces arriving at exactly the right moment to ambush Dark Angel's units or striking at targets whose importance only became apparent days later. Other times, Curze's visions led him to commit forces to operations that served no obvious purpose, wasting resources on objectives that provided no military or strategic benefit. Sevatar and the other senior Night Lord's commanders learned to interpret their Primarchs' prophetic guidance as best they could, attempting to distinguish between visions that provided actionable intelligence and those that were simply manifestations of Curze's deteriorating mental state. The first captain developed a reputation for being able to communicate with the Night Haunter even during his worst episodes, translating the Primarch's fragmentary pronouncements into operational orders that the Legion's companies could execute. This role required Sevatar to make command decisions that would normally fall to the Primarch himself, effectively running the Legion's day-to-day operations, while Curze remained lost in visions of possible futures. The psychological toll of fighting a precognitive opponent became apparent to Lionel Johnson within the first months of the Thramas Crusade. The Lion was accustomed to analyzing his enemies, identifying their patterns and preferences, predicting their likely responses to various tactical situations. This approach had served him well throughout the Great Crusade, allowing him to outmaneuver opponents who possessed superior numbers or better defensive positions. Against Curze, however, conventional analysis proved inadequate. The Night Lord seemed to anticipate Dark Angel's movements with disturbing accuracy, appearing in systems where the First Legion was planning to deploy forces, withdrawing from positions just before Dark Angel's reinforcements arrived, striking at targets whose vulnerability the Lion had not yet recognized. The Lion initially attributed this apparent prescience to superior intelligence gathering or to information leaks within his own command structure. Dark Angel's security forces conducted extensive investigations, searching for traitors or compromised communication systems that might be feeding information to the enemy. these investigations found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The Night Lord's tactical advantages stemmed not from conventional intelligence, but from Curze's visions, which showed him fragments of possible futures where Dark Angel's forces moved according to their Primarchs' plans. The realization that he was fighting an opponent who could see potential outcomes before they occurred forced the Lion to adapt his approach to command, introducing random elements into his planning and maintaining multiple contingency plans for every operation. The frustration that resulted from this situation manifested in the Lion's increasingly aggressive tactical decisions, where the Primarch of the Dark Angels had initially approached the Thramas Crusade with his characteristic methodical planning, seeking to corner and destroy Night Lord's forces through superior coordination and firepower. He began taking greater risks as the campaign progressed. Dark Angel's forces received orders to pursue fleeing Night Lord's units, even when doing so meant moving into terrain that favored ambush, to commit to assaults on fortified positions without the usual extensive reconnaissance, to divide forces in ways that created opportunities for the enemy to achieve local superiority. These decisions reflected the Lion's growing desperation to force a decisive engagement, his recognition that the grinding attritional warfare the campaign had become favored neither side, and that something had to change if the Dark Angels were ever going to achieve their objective of eliminating the Night Lord's threat. The personal confrontations between the two Primarchs during the Thramas Crusade were few but significant. Both commanders generally directed their forces from their flagships or from command posts on critical worlds, understanding that their deaths would represent catastrophic losses for their respective legions. The nature of the campaign made direct meetings between the Primarchs rare, as neither side controlled sufficient territory to establish the kind of secure negotiating positions that might have allowed for parley, even if either commander had been interested in such discussions. The few occasions when Curze and the Lion did encounter each other directly occurred during boarding actions or during battles where both Primarchs deployed to the same planetary surface. One such encounter occurred during the fighting on Thramas itself, when both Primarchs led forces in the battle for the primary hive city. The Lion had deployed with a Deathwing assault force tasked with capturing a critical infrastructure nexus that controlled power distribution for an entire sector of the hive. Curze led a Night Lord's counter-attack personally, recognizing that the loss of the nexus would compromise his legion's defensive positions throughout the surrounding area. The two Primarchs met in combat within the nexus facility itself, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle that had raged through the structure, and by the bodies of Astartes from both legions who had died fighting for control of the position. The duel that followed lasted less than 10 minutes before both Primarchs withdrew, neither having gained decisive advantage over the other. The Lion fought with the controlled precision that characterized all his actions, each strike calculated to create openings for follow-up attacks, his defense absolute and his movements economical. Curze fought like the creature he had become, all savage speed and unpredictable angles of attack, his precognition allowing him to avoid strikes that should have connected and to counter-attack from positions that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The Night Haunter's fighting style reflected his mental state, alternating between moments of brilliant tactical awareness and periods where he seemed to be responding to threats that existed only in his visions rather than to the actual combat situation before him. During the brief periods when the fighting paused and the two Primarchs circled each other, searching for openings, Curze spoke to his brother in ways that revealed the depth of his nihilistic worldview. The Night Haunter described the visions he had seen of the Lion's future, prophecies of betrayal and failure that awaited the Dark Angel's Primarch regardless of the Thramas Crusade's outcome. Curze claimed to have seen the Lion standing amid the ruins of Caliban, to have witnessed the Dark Angels scattered and broken by secrets they had kept hidden even from their own Primarch. The specific details of these prophecies would not be confirmed for years, not until the Heresy's conclusion revealed truths about the First Legion that validated some of what Curze had foreseen, but in the moment they served primarily to unsettle the Lion and to demonstrate that the Night Haunter's madness did not preclude genuine prophetic insight. The The lion's response to these revelations combined denial and rage in equal measure. The Primarch of the Dark Angels rejected Curze's claims about the future, arguing that visions of possible events did not constitute certainty, and that prophecy was a tool of manipulation rather than genuine foresight. Yet the lion's words carried an undertone of doubt that suggested Curze's pronouncements had struck closer to truth than the Dark Angel's Primarch wanted to admit. The exchange demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between the two Primarchs' worldviews. The lion believed in agency and choice, in the ability to shape outcomes through superior planning and execution. Curze had concluded that the future was largely fixed, that his visions showed him what would occur rather than what might occur, and that resistance to fate was ultimately futile. The ideological conflict between the lion's pursuit of order and victory versus Curze's nihilistic embrace of inevitable damnation manifested not just in their personal interactions, but in how each Primarch commanded his legion. The lion demanded absolute discipline from his Dark Angels, expecting his orders to be followed precisely and his strategic vision to be executed without deviation. This approach created a legion that operated with mechanical efficiency, where every warrior understood his role and performed it to exacting standards. The cost of this discipline was a certain rigidity, an inability to adapt quickly when circumstances changed in ways that the lion had not anticipated. Dark Angel's forces sometimes continued executing orders that had become obsolete, following their Primarch's original instructions, even when tactical situations had evolved to make those instructions counterproductive. Curze's command of the Night Lords reflected his acceptance that control was ultimately illusory, and that attempting to impose rigid order on inherently chaotic forces was both futile and counterproductive. The Night Haunter provided his captains with broad strategic guidance and then allowed them enormous latitude in how they achieved their objectives. This decentralized approach created a legion that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances and that could continue operating effectively even when communications with higher command were disrupted or when senior leaders were killed. The cost was a lack of coordination between different Night Lords' elements and a tendency for individual companies to pursue their own agendas rather than contributing to larger strategic goals. The grinding nature of the Thramas Crusade forced both Primarchs to confront the limitations of their respective approaches. The Lion's methodical strategy had been designed to corner and destroy the Night Lords through superior coordination and firepower, but Curze's precognition and the 8th Legion's mobility made it nearly impossible to force the kind of decisive engagement that would allow the Dark Angels to bring their advantages to bear. The Night Lord's terror tactics and hit-and-run attacks were bleeding the Dark Angels slowly, tying down forces that the Lion needed to concentrate for major operations, but they were not achieving the kind of strategic victory that would force the 1st Legion to withdraw from the sector. Both legions were suffering casualties they could not easily replace, losing ships and equipment that represented irreplaceable assets, and committing to a campaign that was consuming resources needed for the larger civil war. The personal toll that the campaign took on both Primarchs became increasingly apparent as the conflict extended into its 3rd year. The Lion grew more withdrawn and more prone to sudden rages when operations failed to achieve their objectives, or when reports arrived of yet another successful Night Lord's raid. The Primarch of the Dark Angels had entered the Thramas Crusade confident that he would destroy Curze's forces within months, and then continue to Terra to fulfill his duty to the Emperor. Instead, he found himself trapped in a grinding attritional campaign against an enemy who refused to be pinned down, and whose Primarch seemed to know the Lion's plans before they were fully formulated. The psychological pressure of fighting a precognitive opponent, combined with the guilt of knowing that every day spent in Thramas was another day he was not defending Terra, created a burden that even a Primarch struggled to bear. Curze's mental state deteriorated further as the campaign progressed, the constant visions and the stress of command pushing him deeper into madness. The Night Haunter experienced periods where he could not distinguish between past, present, and possible futures, where memories of events that had occurred decades ago mixed with visions of things that might happen centuries hence. Sevatar and other senior Night Lords commanders found themselves increasingly responsible for the Legion's operations, translating their Primarchs' incoherent pronouncements into actionable orders, or simply making command decisions themselves when Curze was too lost in his visions to provide guidance. The first captain understood that the Night Lords were fighting a war they could not win in any conventional sense, that the best they could hope for was to bleed the Dark Angels sufficiently that the First Legion would be unable to effectively participate in the larger heresy when they finally withdrew from Thramas. The strategic situation in the Thramas Sector underwent fundamental transformation during the campaign's second year, as both legions committed reinforcements that had been operating elsewhere in the galaxy. The Dark Angels received approximately 8,000 additional Astartes drawn from expeditionary fleets that had been prosecuting campaigns in the galactic north when the heresy began. These reinforcements arrived in scattered groups over several months, their journeys delayed by warp storms and the need to navigate routes that avoided systems known to have fallen to the traitors. The arriving Dark Angels brought with them fresh equipment, ammunition stocks that partially alleviated the supply shortages affecting some First Legion strongholds, and most critically, replacement specialists for the hexagrammaton wings that had suffered disproportionate casualties during the campaign's opening year. The integration of these reinforcements into the existing Dark Angels force structure revealed organizational challenges that the Lion had not fully anticipated. The newly arrived companies had been operating independently for months, developing their own tactical preferences and command relationships that did not necessarily align with the approaches being used by forces already engaged in Thramas. Officers who had been conducting standard compliance operations against human or Xenos opponents found themselves thrust into a grinding war against fellow Astartes, who employed methods that violated every principle of honorable warfare. The psychological adjustment required to fight the kind of campaign that Thramas had become proved difficult for some of these newly arrived Dark Angels, particularly those who had not witnessed the atrocities that the Night Lords inflicted on civilian populations. The Night Lords received their own reinforcements, though in smaller numbers and under circumstances that highlighted the differences between the two legions' organizational structures. Approximately 3,000 additional 8th Legion Astartes reached the Thramas Sector during the same period, drawn from raiding fleets that had been operating along the eastern fringe's periphery. These Night Lords' companies arrived with their ships heavily laden with supplies and equipment scavenged from worlds they had attacked during their journey to Thramas. The reinforcements brought a more feral character to the 8th Legion's operations, as many of these companies had been operating without direct oversight from Curze or other senior commanders for extended periods, and had developed even more extreme interpretations of Night Lord's doctrine than the forces already engaged in the sector. The arrival of fresh forces allowed both Primarchs to contemplate operations that would have been impossible with their depleted strength. The Lion planned a coordinated offensive designed to clear the Night Lords from a dozen systems simultaneously, forcing Curze to either commit his forces to defensive battles where Dark Angel's firepower superiority would prove decisive or to abandon significant territory. The operation required precise coordination between multiple Dark Angels battle groups, with Ravenwing elements screening the advances, Ironwing formations providing breakthrough capability, and Deathwing reserves positioned to exploit any opportunities that developed. The planning process consumed weeks as the Lion and his senior commanders analyzed intelligence reports, identified Night Lord's strong points, and allocated forces to achieve maximum effect. The offensive launched in the Carta's subsector, targeting 6 systems that intelligence suggested contained significant Night Lords' presence. The Dark Angels advanced according to their Primarch's carefully constructed plan, with each battle group moving toward its assigned objectives while maintaining communications with neighboring forces. The initial advances proceeded smoothly, with Dark Angels' forces securing orbital control of 3 systems within the first week, and deploying ground forces to eliminate Night Lords' garrisons that offered only token resistance before withdrawing. The ease of these early victories should have warned the Lion that something was wrong, that the Night Lords were not fighting with the desperation that would be expected from forces facing elimination. The trap closed when Dark Angel's forces in the Cartas system itself came under attack from Night Lord's fleet elements that had been hiding in the system's outer reaches, using the interference from a local stellar phenomenon to mask their presence from Dark Angel's sensors. The Night Lord squadron struck at the Dark Angel's supply convoy that was moving forward to support the ground offensive, destroying or crippling 24 transport vessels before the convoy's escorts could respond effectively. Simultaneously, Night Lord's ground forces that had supposedly withdrawn from the systems, the Dark Angels had just secured launched coordinated counterattacks against the First Legion's newly established positions, hitting supply depots and command posts with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about Dark Angel's deployments. The Cartas offensive collapsed into a desperate fighting withdrawal as the Lion recognized that his forces had been drawn into an untenable position. The Dark Angels battle groups that had advanced deepest into the subsector found their supply lines cut and their communications disrupted by Night Lord's raids that seemed to anticipate every attempt to restore order. The withdrawal cost the Dark Angels nearly 1,200 Astartes killed or missing, along with the loss of significant armor and equipment that had to be abandoned when transport capacity proved insufficient to evacuate everything. The operation represented the most significant tactical defeat the First Legion had suffered during the Thramas Crusade, and demonstrated that Curze's precognition could be weaponized not just for small-scale ambushes, but for operational-level deception. The failure of the Cartas offensive forced the Lion to reassess his entire approach to the campaign. The methodical strategy that had served him throughout the Great Crusade was proving inadequate against an opponent who could see the outlines of his plans before they were executed. The Dark Angels needed to force the Night Lords into battle under circumstances where precognition provided minimal advantage, situations where the fighting would be so chaotic and the timescales so compressed that even foreknowledge of general outcomes would not allow for effective counter-planning. This realization led to a fundamental shift in Dark Angel's doctrine during the campaign's latter stages, with the Lion authorizing more aggressive and less predictable operations than his forces had previously conducted. The Void War intensified dramatically as both legions committed their reinforced fleets to operations designed to achieve decisive advantage in orbital space. The engagement at the Coronis cluster involved the largest concentration of capital ships that either side had assembled during the entire campaign, with the Dark Angels deploying 6 battle barges and over 30 strike cruisers against a Night Lord's force of comparable size. The battle lasted for 3 days of continuous combat as the two fleets maneuvered through the cluster's asteroid fields and around its dying stars, each side attempting to isolate and destroy enemy squadrons while protecting their own vessels from concentrated attack. The Invincible Reason participated directly in the Coronis engagement, with the Lion commanding from his flagship's bridge as the Gloriana-class battleship anchored the Dark Angels battle line. The massive vessel's weapons batteries engaged Night Lord's ships at extreme range, destroying 2 strike cruisers and crippling a battle barge during the engagement's opening hours. The Night Lords adapted by refusing to close to the ranges where the Invincible Reason's firepower could be brought to bear most effectively, instead using their superior knowledge of the local space to draw Dark Angel squadrons into positions where they could be ambushed by Night Lord's forces hiding among the asteroids or behind stellar interference. The Nightfall emerged from hiding during the battle's second day, Curze's flagship having remained concealed while the engagement developed. The Night Lord's command ship led a squadron that struck at Dark Angel's vessels that had become separated from the main fleet while pursuing what they believed to be a fleeing enemy force. The ambush destroyed 3 Dark Angels strike cruisers and damaged several others before reinforcements could arrive, demonstrating the risks inherent in the aggressive pursuit tactics that the Lion had authorized. The Nightfall withdrew before the Invincible Reason could bring its weapons to bear, disappearing back into the cluster's maze of asteroids and radiation zones that made sensor tracking unreliable. The Corynus engagement concluded without decisive victory for either side, though both had inflicted significant damage on their opponent's fleet. The Dark Angels lost 8 strike cruisers and numerous escort vessels, casualties that represented a meaningful reduction in their ability to maintain patrol coverage across the sector. The Night Lords suffered proportionally higher losses, with 11 ships destroyed and many others damaged severely enough to require extensive repairs. The battle demonstrated that neither legion possessed sufficient superiority to achieve the kind of overwhelming void victory that would allow them to dominate orbital space throughout the sector. The increasing brutality of the ground campaigns reflected both legions' growing desperation to achieve advantage through any means available. The Dark Angels expanded their use of Dreadwing assets, deploying rad weapons and phosphex with decreasing restraint against Night Lords' positions. Entire city blocks on contested worlds were rendered uninhabitable by radiation or consumed by fires that burned for weeks, killing not only the enemy defenders, but also any civilians who remained in the affected zones. The Lion justified these escalations as necessary responses to Night Lords' tactics, arguing that conventional weapons had proven insufficient against an enemy who used civilian populations as shields, and who fortified positions in ways that made standard assault operations prohibitively costly. The Night Lords responded to the Dark Angels' increased use of mass destruction weapons by intensifying their own atrocities against civilian populations. Where previously the 8th Legion had conducted their terror operations with at least nominal connection to military objectives, they now engaged in violence that served no purpose beyond inflicting suffering and provoking their enemies into emotional responses. The mining world of Heras lost its entire population of 6 million to a Night Lords campaign that systematically depopulated the planet over the course of 2 months. The 8th Legion made no attempt to destroy the mining facilities or to disrupt ore production, focusing exclusively on the elimination of the workforce through methods calculated to maximize horror among those who discovered the evidence of what had been done. The Forge world of Tanagra became the site of the most controversial Dark Angels operation during the entire Thramas Crusade. Night Lords' forces had fortified positions throughout the Forge world's primary manufacturing complex, using the facility's civilian workforce as human shields and threatening to destroy critical infrastructure if the Dark Angels attempted to assault their positions. The Lion authorized a Dreadwing strike that deployed vortex weapons against the Night Lords' positions, devices that tore holes in reality itself and consumed everything within their radius of effect. The vortex weapons eliminated the Night Lords' garrison completely, but also killed tens of thousands of civilians and caused catastrophic damage to the Forge complex that rendered it unusable for the remainder of the campaign. The Tanagra operation generated significant controversy within the Dark Angels command structure, with several senior officers questioning whether the Lion had crossed a line that should not have been crossed even in war against traitors. The debate centered not on the morality of killing civilians, as the realities of warfare in the 31st millennium made such casualties inevitable, but rather on whether the destruction of the Forge complex served any strategic purpose that justified the loss of its manufacturing capacity. The Lion silenced the debate by pointing out that allowing the Night Lords to hold the Forge world would have been equally unacceptable, and that conventional assault would have resulted in higher Dark Angels casualties, with no guarantee of preserving the facility. The Primarch's decision reflected his increasingly ruthless approach to the campaign and his willingness to accept any cost to prevent the Night Lords from achieving their objectives. News from the wider heresy began reaching both Primarchs during the campaign's 2nd and 3rd years, fragmentary reports that arrived via astropathic relay or through vessels that had escaped from war zones elsewhere in the galaxy. The formation of the Ruinstorm dominated these reports, descriptions of a massive warp phenomenon that had engulfed entire sectors and that seemed to be cutting off the eastern fringe from Terra. The Ruin Storm's existence had profound implications for both Legion's strategic calculations, though the exact nature of those implications took time to become clear as more information arrived, and as both Primarchs attempted to understand what the storm meant for their respective positions. For the Lion, the Ruin Storm represented both a strategic disaster and a potential justification for decisions he had already made. The Warp Storm made it impossible for the Dark Angels to reach Terra through any direct route, validating the Lion's earlier decision to pursue the Night Lords rather than continuing immediately toward the Throne World. If the routes to Terra were blocked by impassable warp phenomena, then the time spent fighting in Thramas had not actually delayed the Dark Angels' arrival at the Imperial Palace. This reasoning provided some comfort to the Lion, but did not address the larger question of what role the First Legion should play in a heresy where they could not reach the primary theater of operations. The Primarch began receiving reports of Imperium Secundus, Roboute Guilliman's attempt to create a backup capital for the Imperium in Ultramar, though the details remained unclear, and the Lion's response to this information was complicated by his relationship with his brother and by questions about the legitimacy of such an undertaking. Curze's response to news of the Ruin Storm revealed the extent to which his prophetic visions had already shown him aspects of what was occurring elsewhere in the galaxy. The Night Haunter claimed to have foreseen the storm's formation, describing it as a manifestation of the warp's true nature and as proof that the material universe was being consumed by the forces of chaos. The accuracy of these claims remained difficult to verify, as Curze's pronouncements about his visions were often cryptic and subject to interpretation. What became clear was that the Ruin Storm's existence did not significantly alter the Night Lord's strategic approach to the Thramas Crusade, as Curze had never been primarily concerned with achieving conventional military objectives or with supporting the War Master's larger strategic goals. The reports of Imperium Secundus created complex political and strategic considerations for both Primarchs. The Lion received direct communications from Guilliman, requesting that the Dark Angels withdraw from Thramas and redeploy to Ultramar, where they could contribute to the defense of the 500 worlds and participate in the governance of the new Imperium. These requests placed the Lion in a difficult position, as abandoning the Thramas Crusade would mean allowing the Night Lords to continue their terror campaign unopposed, and would represent an admission that the First Legion had failed to achieve its objectives. The Lion's pride and his sense of duty made such a withdrawal difficult to contemplate, even as the strategic logic of concentrating loyalist forces in Ultramar became increasingly compelling. The intensity of combat operations increased as both legions recognized that the campaign was approaching some form of resolution, though what that resolution would look like remained unclear. The Dark Angels launched a series of void ambushes designed to catch Night Lord's vessels during their most vulnerable moments, positioning forces along warp routes that intelligence suggested the 8th Legion used for moving between systems. These ambush operations achieved mixed success, with some resulting in the destruction of isolated Night Lord squadrons, while others found no targets or were themselves ambushed by enemy forces that seemed to have anticipated the Dark Angel's presence. The planetary siege of Diamat represented the Night Lord's most ambitious conventional military operation during the entire campaign. Curze committed nearly half his available ground forces to an assault on the Dark Angel's primary stronghold in the sector, recognizing that capturing or destroying the Lion's main base would force a fundamental change in the strategic situation. The Night Lords approached the siege with uncharacteristic patience, establishing positions around Diamat's orbital facilities and conducting a systematic campaign to isolate the system from reinforcement or resupply. The siege lasted for 7 months and consumed both legions' attention, with neither able to commit significant forces to operations elsewhere in the sector, while the battle for Diamat remained unresolved. The grinding nature of the Diamat siege demonstrated how far both legions had fallen from their original doctrines, and how completely the Thramas Crusade had consumed their attention and resources. The Dark Angel's garrison fought with desperate determination, knowing that the loss of Diamat would compromise their ability to maintain operations throughout the sector. The Night Lords prosecuted the siege with a combination of conventional military operations and their characteristic terror tactics, attempting to break the defenders' morale while simultaneously reducing their physical capability to resist. Neither approach proved decisive, and the siege devolved into a brutal attritional struggle where both sides measured progress in meters gained and casualties inflicted rather than in strategic objectives achieved. The withdrawal of the Night Lords from their positions throughout the Thramas Sector began gradually during the campaign's third year, so subtly that Dark Angel's intelligence officers initially failed to recognize it as a coordinated movement. Night Lords companies that had been conducting terror operations across dozens of worlds simply ceased their attacks and disappeared, their vessels translating into the warp without warning or apparent destination. The pattern repeated across the sector over several weeks, with Night Lords' forces abandoning positions they had held for months and evacuating systems where they had established what appeared to be permanent bases of operation. The Dark Angels discovered emptied supply caches, abandoned fortifications, and worlds where the only evidence of recent Night Lords' presence consisted of the atrocities they had inflicted on civilian populations before departing. Lionel Johnson recognized the withdrawal for what it represented before most of his subordinates understood its significance. The Night Lords were not retreating in disarray or abandoning the campaign due to unsustainable casualties. They were consolidating, gathering their scattered forces for some purpose that Curze had not yet revealed. The Lion's experience fighting his brother over 3 years of grinding warfare had taught him that the Night Haunter rarely acted without reason, even when his actions seemed incomprehensible to outside observers. The withdrawal meant that Curze was preparing for something, establishing conditions for a confrontation that would occur on terms the Night Lord's Primarch had chosen rather than circumstances the Dark Angels could dictate. The Dark Angels' intelligence network worked to identify where the Night Lords were gathering, analyzing astropathic intercepts and interrogating captured 8th Legion Astartes who proved willing to provide information in exchange for quick deaths rather than extended interrogation. The name Tsagualsa emerged from multiple sources, a world that appeared on no standard Imperial charts, and that seemed to exist in a region of space the Administratum had classified as unexplored during the Great Crusade. The fragmentary information available suggested that Tsagualsa served as some form of fortress world for the Night Lords, a place where Curze had established a stronghold during the years before the heresy. The world's location in a region of unstable warp currents explained why it had remained hidden from Imperial surveys, as the approaches to the system required navigation through warp routes that standard doctrine would classify as too dangerous for routine transit. The Lion faced a decision that would determine the Thramas Crusade's ultimate outcome. The Dark Angels could declare victory based on the Night Lords' withdrawal from the sector, consolidate their control over the systems they had secured, and redeploy to Ultramar as Guilliman had requested. This course of action would preserve Dark Angel's strength and allow the First Legion to participate in whatever role Imperium Secundus required of them. The alternative was to pursue the Night Lords to Tsagualsa and force a final confrontation that would eliminate the 8th Legion as an effective fighting force. The pursuit would require the Dark Angels to follow their enemies into unknown space, to assault a fortress world that Curze had presumably prepared specifically to defend against the kind of attack the First Legion would mount, and to commit forces to an operation whose outcome remained uncertain. The Primarch of the Dark Angels chose pursuit without extensive deliberation, his decision driven by a combination of strategic calculation and personal pride. Strategically, allowing the Night Lords to survive intact meant they could resume their terror campaign once the Dark Angels withdrew, threatening Imperial worlds throughout the eastern fringe and potentially interdicting the supply routes that Ultramar would need to sustain Imperium Secundus. The Night Lords had to be destroyed completely to ensure they could not continue to pose a threat to loyalist operations in the region. On a personal level, the Lion could not accept that 3 years of brutal warfare had ended with his enemy simply withdrawing to fight another day. The campaign had cost the Dark Angels thousands of Astartes killed, dozens of ships destroyed, and irreplaceable equipment and supplies consumed in a grinding attritional struggle. The idea of allowing Curze to escape without decisive defeat was intolerable to the Lion's sense of honor and his understanding of what victory required. The Dark Angels fleet that departed for Tsagualsa represented the majority of the First Legion's remaining strength in the eastern fringe. The Lion committed approximately 30,000 Astartes to the operation, leaving only minimal garrison forces in the systems the Dark Angels had secured during the campaign. The Invincible Reason led a fleet of battle barges, strike cruisers, and supporting vessels that numbered over 200 ships, a concentration of force sufficient to reduce most worlds to compliance through orbital bombardment alone. The fleet's navigators received what information Dark Angels intelligence had gathered about the routes to Tsagualsa, though all understood that the final approach to the system would require them to navigate through warp space that had never been properly charted and that might contain hazards no amount of preparation could anticipate. The journey to Tsagualsa consumed weeks of subjective time as the Dark Angels fleet made its way through the warp along routes that grew increasingly unstable as they approached their destination. Ships that strayed too far from the main fleet reported encounters with warp phenomena that defied rational explanation, visions that appeared on sensor screens showing possible futures or impossible geometries that hurt to observe. 3 vessels were lost during the journey, disappearing into the immaterium without trace or emerging from the warp so damaged that they had to be scuttled. The navigators who guided the fleet through these treacherous passages pushed themselves to the limits of their abilities, many suffering permanent damage to their third eyes or experiencing prophetic visions that left them catatonic for days after the fleet reached its destination. Tsagualsa itself appeared in real space as a world that seemed designed to embody the Night Lord's aesthetic preferences and tactical doctrines. The planet orbited a dying star whose light had shifted into the red spectrum, bathing the surface in a perpetual crimson twilight that created shadows deep enough to hide entire armies. The world's surface consisted of jagged mountain ranges, separated by deep valleys where darkness gathered so completely that standard optical sensors could not penetrate it. Massive structures dotted the landscape, fortifications that had been carved directly into the mountains or built from the black stone that seemed to be the planet's primary geological feature. These fortress complexes bore evidence of decades of construction and modification, their walls studded with weapons emplacements and sensor arrays that tracked the Dark Angels fleet as it entered orbit. The orbital approaches to Tsagualsa demonstrated that Curze had prepared extensively for the Dark Angels' arrival. The system's outer reaches contained debris fields that analysis suggested were the remains of previous visitors who had attempted to reach the world without authorization. Defense platforms hung in carefully calculated orbits, their weapons batteries covering approach vectors that any attacking fleet would need to use to achieve stable orbit. Minefields drifted through the spaces between the platforms, each mine equipped with sensors that could detect ships attempting to pass through the defensive perimeter. The Night Lords had transformed their fortress world into a killing ground, designed specifically to bleed any attacking force during the vulnerable period when they were committing to assault operations. The Lion studied the tactical situation from the Invincible Reason's bridge, analyzing sensor data and consulting with his senior commanders about the optimal approach to reducing Tsagualsa's defenses. The fortress world's orbital defenses were formidable but not insurmountable for a fleet of the size and capability that the Dark Angels had brought to the system. The real challenge would come during the ground assault, when Dark Angels' forces would need to fight through fortifications that Curze had designed specifically to counter the First Legion's tactical preferences. The Night Lords would have the advantage of prepared positions, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to use the planet's perpetual twilight to mask their movements and launch ambushes from unexpected directions. The Dark Angels' assault on Tsagualsa began with a systematic reduction of the orbital defenses that would have made the operation prohibitively costly if conducted against a world with conventional garrison strength. The Invincible Reason anchored the fleet's battle line, its weapons batteries engaging defense platforms at extreme range, while strike cruisers moved forward to clear the minefields and eliminate smaller defensive installations. The orbital battle lasted for 3 days as the Dark Angels methodically destroyed or disabled each element of Tsagualsa's defensive network, accepting casualties to their escort vessels and damage to several strike cruisers in exchange for establishing orbital superiority that would allow them to deploy ground forces without facing constant fire from space-based weapons. The Night Lords contested the orbital battle with less intensity than the Dark Angels had anticipated, their defense platforms fighting until destroyed, but receiving no reinforcement from vessels that might have been hidden elsewhere in the system. The lack of significant void combat suggested that Curze had committed the majority of his fleet to other operations, or that the Night Lords had sustained fleet losses during the Thramas Crusade that prevented them from mounting effective resistance in space. The relative ease with which the Dark Angels achieved orbital control should have served as a warning that the Night Lords were conserving their strength for the ground campaign, where the fortress world's terrain and prepared defenses would provide maximum advantage to the defenders. The initial Dark Angels landings targeted multiple fortress complexes simultaneously, with drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships delivering Astartes directly to the surface, while heavier equipment was deployed via bulk landers once landing zones could be secured. The Lion divided his forces according to hexagrammaton specializations, assigning each wing objectives that matched their particular capabilities. Deathwing Terminators would assault the most heavily fortified positions, their tactical dreadnought armor allowing them to withstand the concentrated fire that defenders could bring to bear on attacking forces. Ravenwing elements would conduct reconnaissance operations, mapping the fortress complexes and identifying routes that assault forces could use to penetrate deeper into the Night Lords' defensive networks. The fighting that erupted across Tsagualsa's surface demonstrated that the Night Lords intended to make the Dark Angels pay for every meter of ground gained. The fortress complexes had been designed with overlapping fields of fire that forced attacking forces to advance through killing zones, where they would be exposed to weapons fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The structures themselves incorporated the black stone that formed much of Tsagualsa's geology, material that proved remarkably resistant to the weapons the Dark Angels brought to bear against it. Demolition charges that should have breached fortress walls merely scarred the stone's surface, and sustained fire from las cannons and plasma weapons was required to create openings large enough for assault teams to exploit. The perpetual twilight that covered Tsagualsa created conditions that favored the Night Lords' preferred methods of warfare. The darkness was not absolute, as the dying star provided enough illumination to see by, but the deep shadows and the red-shifted light made it difficult to identify targets at any significant distance. Night Lords' forces used the shadows to mask their movements, appearing from concealment to launch attacks before disappearing back into the darkness. The 8th Legion had equipped their fortifications with systems that allowed them to manipulate the available light, creating zones of deeper darkness, where Dark Angels' forces found their visual sensors nearly useless, and where even enhanced Astartes' vision struggled to penetrate the gloom. The assault on the primary fortress complex, a massive structure that intelligence suggested served as Curze's headquarters, became the focus of the Dark Angels' ground campaign. The complex had been carved into a mountain that dominated the surrounding terrain, its walls rising hundreds of meters from the valley floor, and its interior extending deep into the mountain's core. The approaches to the fortress led through narrow valleys, where attacking forces would be channeled into predetermined kill zones, and the fortress walls bristled with weapons emplacements that could engage targets at ranges where return fire would be ineffective. The Lion recognized that conventional assault would result in catastrophic casualties, but he also understood that destroying or capturing this fortress would break the Night Lord's defensive coherence and potentially end the campaign. The Dark Angels deployed Dreadwing assets against the primary fortress complex, recognizing that conventional weapons had proven insufficient to reduce the Night Lord's prepared defenses. Phosphex weapons created firestorms in the valleys surrounding the fortress, consuming the oxygen and creating temperatures that made the approaches impassable for hours after deployment. Rad weapons contaminated entire sections of the fortress's outer defenses, forcing Night Lord's defenders to withdraw from positions that had been rendered lethal even to Astartes' physiology. The use of these mass destruction weapons reflected the Lion's determination to achieve victory regardless of the methods required, and his acceptance that the campaign had progressed beyond any point where conventional restraints on weapons employment remained relevant. The breakthrough came when firewing teams identified a network of tunnels that connected different sections of the fortress complex, passages that the Night Lords used to move forces between defensive positions without exposing themselves to Dark Angel's fire. The tunnels had not been designed as primary access routes and were therefore less heavily defended than the fortress's main entrances. Deathwing assault teams deployed into these tunnels via teleportation, appearing deep within the fortress complex and fighting their way toward critical infrastructure that intelligence suggested controlled the fortress's power distribution and life support systems. The tunnel fighting was brutal and conducted in near-total darkness, with both sides struggling to maintain unit coherence in the confined spaces where standard tactical formations became impossible to maintain. The Lion deployed to Tsaguelsa's surface personally once the Dark Angels had established sufficient presence within the primary fortress complex to justify the risk of committing the Primarch to ground operations. The decision reflected both tactical calculation and personal necessity, as the Lion recognized that his presence would inspire the Dark Angel's forces fighting through the fortress's defenses, and that the confrontation with Curze that had defined the Thramas Crusade required resolution through direct combat between the two Primarchs. The Invincible Reason's teleportarium delivered the Lion and his command squad directly to a position near the fortress's central keep, the structure that rose from the mountain's peak, and that served as the ultimate objective of the Dark Angel's assault. Konrad Curze waited for his brother in a chamber that occupied the keep's highest level, a space whose walls had been decorated with trophies taken from victims across 2 centuries of terror campaigns. The room's lighting came from braziers that burned with chemical flames, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and creating an atmosphere of menace that reflected the Night Haunter's psychological state. Curze stood alone when the Lion entered, having dismissed or killed any Night Lords who might have served as bodyguards. The Night Haunter's appearance shocked even the Lion, who had witnessed his brother's deterioration during their previous encounters throughout the Thramas Crusade. Curze's armor was damaged and poorly maintained, covered in old blood and decorated with fragments of bone that might have come from enemies or from the Night Haunter himself. His face bore fresh wounds that appeared self-inflicted, and his eyes held a quality that suggested he was seeing things that existed only in his prophetic visions. The confrontation between the two Primarchs began with words rather than violence, as both recognized that what occurred in this chamber would determine not just the Thramas Crusade's outcome, but also their own understanding of what the heresy meant and what futures it made possible. Curze spoke of his visions, describing futures he had seen where the Imperium collapsed into tyranny and oppression, where the Emperor's dream of human unity devolved into the exact kind of authoritarian nightmare that the Great Crusade had supposedly been designed to prevent. The Night Haunter claimed that his rebellion against the Emperor was not betrayal, but rather acceptance of truth, recognition that the Imperium's founding principles were lies, and that only through embracing humanity's capacity for darkness could any lasting order be achieved. The Lion rejected these arguments with a certainty that reflected his own unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and his belief in the Imperium's mission. The Primarch of the Dark Angels acknowledged that the Imperium was imperfect, that its methods sometimes required brutality, and that its expansion had caused suffering, but he maintained that these costs were justified by the alternative of allowing humanity to remain scattered and vulnerable to Xeno's predation and chaos corruption. The Lion argued that Curze's visions showed possible futures rather than inevitable outcomes, that the choices made by individuals and institutions could shape what came to pass, and that surrendering to nihilistic acceptance of damnation was itself a choice rather than an unavoidable fate. The philosophical debate ended when both Primarchs recognized that words would not resolve the fundamental incompatibility between their worldviews. The combat that followed was not the ritualized duel of champions, but rather a savage struggle between two beings who had been designed as weapons and who understood violence on a level that transcended normal human experience. The Lion fought with the controlled precision that characterized all his actions, each strike calculated to create openings for follow-up attacks and each movement economical in its efficiency. Curze fought with the desperate savagery of someone who had already seen his own death and who no longer feared it, his precognition allowing him to avoid strikes that should have connected, while launching counterattacks from angles that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The chamber where they fought became a wreck as the two Primarchs crashed through furniture and decorations, their weapons scoring the black stone walls and their impacts creating cracks in the floor. Neither could gain decisive advantage, as the Lion's superior technique was balanced by Curze's prophetic awareness of where attacks would come from. The Night Haunter's fighting style incorporated elements of madness that made him unpredictable even to himself, his actions sometimes responding to threats that existed only in possible futures rather than to the actual combat situation. This unpredictability made him dangerous in ways that conventional tactical analysis could not account for, as he would sometimes leave himself exposed to attacks that never came or would defend against strikes that the Lion had not yet decided to make. The duel's conclusion came not through decisive combat superiority, but through the intervention of external factors that neither Primarch had fully controlled. The Dark Angel's forces fighting through the fortress complex below had succeeded in their objective of destroying the power systems that maintained the keep's structural integrity. The chamber where the two Primarchs fought began to collapse as supports failed, and as the mountain itself started to tear apart from the damage that had been inflicted on its interior. The Lion recognized the danger and attempted to withdraw, but Curze pressed the attack with suicidal determination, forcing his brother to continue fighting even as the floor cracked beneath them and the walls began to crumble. The decision that followed would define the Lion's reputation for the remainder of the heresy and beyond. The Primarch of the Dark Angels ordered orbital bombardment of the primary fortress complex while he was still inside it, while he was still locked in combat with Curze. The bombardment came from the Invincible Reason and supporting vessels, their weapons batteries firing on coordinates that the Lion transmitted from his armor systems. The strikes were not cyclonic torpedoes designed to crack the planet's crust, but rather concentrated lance strikes and macro cannon fire intended to reduce the fortress complex to rubble and to ensure that nothing within it could survive. The bombardment demonstrated the Lion's willingness to risk his own life to ensure Curze's death, and his acceptance that some enemies could only be defeated through methods that might claim the victor along with the vanquished. The bombardment's initial strikes hit the keep while both Primarchs were still fighting, the impacts throwing them apart and causing the structure to begin its final collapse. The Lion fought his way toward an exit even as the building came down around him, his enhanced physiology allowing him to survive impacts that would have killed normal Astartes. Curze made no attempt to escape, instead standing amid the collapsing structure, as if welcoming the death that his visions had shown him. The keep collapsed completely as subsequent bombardment strikes hit, burying both Primarchs under thousands of tons of rubble and shattered stone. The Dark Angel's forces fighting elsewhere in the fortress complex received orders to withdraw as the orbital bombardment intensified, the fleet systematically destroying every structure and defensive position that the Night Lords had built on Sagualsa. The bombardment continued for hours, reducing the fortress complexes to rubble and creating firestorms that consumed what the initial strikes had left standing. The Night Lords who survived the bombardment found themselves scattered and leaderless, their defensive positions destroyed and their command structure shattered. Many withdrew into the deep valleys where the darkness was absolute, disappearing into Sagualsa's wilderness, rather than facing certain death in continued combat against an enemy who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy the entire world to achieve victory. Recovery teams located the Lion 3 days after the bombardment concluded, finding the Primarch buried under rubble but alive. The Primarch of the Dark Angels had sustained severe injuries that would require extended recovery, including damage to his spine and internal organs that even Astartes' physiology struggled to heal. The recovery teams found no sign of Curze's body in the ruins of the keep, though whether the Night Haunter had escaped or whether his remains were simply buried too deeply to locate remained unclear. The absence of definitive proof of Curze's death meant that the Lion could not claim complete victory, though the destruction of the Night Lord's fortress world and the scattering of their forces represented a strategic success that effectively ended the 8th Legion's ability to conduct coordinated operations in the Eastern Fringe. The casualty assessments that followed the conclusion of active operations at Sagualsa revealed the true cost of the 3-year campaign that had consumed both legions. The Dark Angels had deployed approximately 50,000 Astartes to the Thramas Sector at the campaign's beginning, a force that represented the majority of the 1st Legion's strength in the Eastern Fringe. The Butcher's Bill compiled by Legion administrators documented 25,000 Dark Angels killed in action, with another 10,000 wounded seriously enough to require extended recovery periods that would prevent them from participating in future operations for months or years. The losses were not distributed evenly across the Legion's structure. The Dreadwing had suffered disproportionate casualties due to their deployment in the most hazardous assault operations, losing nearly 40% of their strength. The Deathwing's losses approached 35%, with many of the Legion's most experienced Terminator armored veterans having fallen during boarding actions and fortress assaults, where their tactical dreadnought armor had been the only thing standing between success and catastrophic failure. The Raven Wing had lost approximately 30% of its strength, casualties that included not just the mounted warriors themselves, but also the specialized bikes and land speeders that could not be easily replaced given the Dark Angels' distance from major forge worlds and supply depots. The Iron Wing's armored formations had been reduced by similar proportions, with tank crews and their vehicles destroyed in the grinding battles for contested worlds, where armor had been essential for achieving breakthrough against prepared defensive positions. The Firewing's losses were harder to quantify precisely, as many of their operations had been conducted in circumstances where recovery of bodies or confirmation of deaths proved impossible, but estimates suggested that approximately 25% of the wing's strength had been eliminated during the campaign. Beyond the raw numbers of Astartes killed or wounded, the Dark Angels had lost significant fleet assets that would prove difficult to replace. 37 strike cruisers had been destroyed during void engagements or orbital operations, along with over 100 escort vessels and numerous support ships. Several battle barges had sustained damage severe enough to require months of repair work in proper shipyard facilities, work that could not be conducted in the field with the limited resources available to the Legion in the Eastern Fringe. The loss of transport capacity meant that the Dark Angels' ability to conduct rapid redeployment operations had been severely compromised, as the surviving ships were insufficient to move the entire remaining legions simultaneously. The Night Lords had suffered even more severely in absolute terms, though their decentralized structure made precise casualty assessment more difficult than for the Dark Angels. Intelligence estimates suggested that the 8th Legion had deployed approximately 40,000 Astartes to the Thramas Sector over the course of the campaign, with reinforcements arriving throughout the conflict to replace losses and to expand the Night Lord's operational capacity. Of this force, approximately 28,000 were confirmed killed or missing by the campaign's conclusion, with the remainder scattered across the Eastern Fringe in company, strength units, or smaller groups that had become separated from any larger command structure during the final battles on Sagualsa or during the withdrawal that preceded them. The Night Lord's fleet had been devastated more thoroughly than their ground forces, with over 60% of their strike cruisers destroyed and the remainder damaged to varying degrees. The Nightfall had survived the Tsagualsa operation, though whether Konrad Curze remained aboard or had perished in the fortress complex's destruction remained unknown to Dark Angel's intelligence. The loss of so many vessels meant that the surviving Night Lord's companies lacked the transport capacity to operate as a unified legion, forcing them to disperse across the eastern fringe and to continue their terror campaigns as independent warbands with minimal coordination between different groups. The strategic impact of these casualties on both legions' combat effectiveness was profound and would shape their roles in the remaining years of the heresy. The Dark Angels retained sufficient strength to conduct major operations, but they had been reduced from a force capable of prosecuting campaigns across multiple sectors simultaneously to one that could realistically only commit to single large-scale operations at a time. The loss of so many specialized warriors from the Hexagrammaton wings meant that the remaining Dark Angels forces lacked the depth of expertise that had previously allowed them to respond to virtually any tactical situation, with specialists trained specifically for those conditions. The Legion's ability to conduct the kind of coordinated multi-wing operations that had characterized their approach to warfare during the Great Crusade had been severely compromised. The fleet losses compounded these problems by limiting the Dark Angel's strategic mobility. The remaining ships were sufficient to transport the Legion's surviving Astartes, but there was little excess capacity for the kind of rapid redeployment that would be necessary if the Dark Angels needed to respond to multiple threats in quick succession. The damage to several battle barges meant that the Legion's ability to conduct orbital assault operations had been reduced, as these vessels served as the primary platforms for deploying large numbers of Astartes directly from orbit to planetary surfaces. The loss of so many escort vessels meant that Dark Angel's convoys and patrol forces operated with reduced security, making them more vulnerable to the kind of raiding attacks that had proven so effective during the Thramas Crusade. The Night Lord's fragmentation following the Crusade represented the effective destruction of the 8th Legion as a unified fighting force capable of conducting coordinated operations at the strategic level. The surviving Night Lord's companies dispersed throughout the eastern fringe and beyond, each operating independently according to the preferences of its captain and with minimal regard for any larger strategic objectives. Some companies continued to conduct terror campaigns against Imperial worlds, maintaining the methods that had defined the Legion during the Great Crusade and the Heresy. Others descended into simple piracy, raiding merchant vessels and isolated outposts for supplies and equipment without any pretense of serving military or ideological goals. The absence of confirmed information about Curze's fate contributed to this fragmentation, as different Night Lords captains interpreted the situation according to their own preferences and beliefs. Some maintained that the Night Haunter had survived and would eventually reunite the scattered companies, using this belief to justify continuing operations that they claimed served the Primarchs' vision. Others concluded that Curze had perished on Tsagualsa and that the 8th Legion's time as a unified force had ended, embracing their independence and rejecting any obligation to coordinate with other Night Lords' elements. The lack of any central authority capable of imposing discipline or directing the Legion's operations meant that these competing interpretations coexisted without resolution. The descent into scattered warbands accelerated as the heresy progressed, and as the Night Lords' companies found themselves operating in an increasingly hostile strategic environment. Loyalist forces throughout the eastern fringe recognized that the scattered Night Lords' elements represented manageable threats that could be hunted down and destroyed piecemeal, leading to campaigns specifically designed to eliminate individual companies before they could reunite with other 8th Legion forces. The Night Lords' reputation for terror tactics meant that they received no quarter from Imperial forces who encountered them, with prisoners rarely taken and captured Night Lords typically executed immediately rather than being held for interrogation or potential exchange. The long-term psychological consequences of the Thramas Crusade on both legions proved as significant as the physical casualties, though these effects manifested differently for each force. The Dark Angels emerged from the campaign with a deepened sense of paranoia and secrecy that would define their culture for millennia to come. The experience of fighting an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move, who struck from shadows and withdrew before decisive engagement, could be achieved, reinforced existing tendencies within the First Legion toward compartmentalization of information and toward maintaining multiple layers of internal security. The Dark Angels who had fought at Thramas learned to trust no one completely, to verify all intelligence multiple times before acting on it, and to assume that any plan might be compromised before execution. This paranoia extended to the Legion's relationship with other Imperial forces and even with other Loyalist legions. The Dark Angels who had spent 3 years fighting the Night Lords had witnessed what could happen when Astartes turned their capabilities against Imperial citizens and against their own brothers. The knowledge that transhuman warriors could descend to such depths of depravity created a lasting suspicion about the reliability of any force that had not been personally vetted and whose loyalty had not been proven through extended observation. This attitude would contribute to the Dark Angels' isolation in the years following the heresy and to their reluctance to cooperate fully with other Imperial institutions. The experience of deploying Dreadwing assets with decreasing restraint throughout the campaign had normalized the use of weapons that the Dark Angels had previously reserved for the most extreme circumstances. The Phosphex, rad weapons, and vortex devices that had been deployed against Night Lords' positions on dozens of worlds had proven effective in ways that conventional weapons could not match, and this effectiveness created a precedent that would influence Dark Angels' doctrine for generations. The willingness to accept massive collateral damage in pursuit of military objectives became embedded in the Legion's tactical culture, justified by reference to the Thramas Crusade and to the argument that some enemies could only be defeated through methods that transcended conventional rules of engagement. The Lion's decision to order orbital bombardment while he was still fighting Curze in the fortress complex became a defining moment in how the Dark Angels understood their Primarch and their own role in the Imperium. The willingness to risk personal death to ensure the enemy's destruction demonstrated a level of commitment that inspired fierce loyalty among those who served under the Lion, but it also revealed a ruthlessness that some found troubling. The incident reinforced the perception that the Dark Angels and their Primarch would do whatever was necessary to achieve victory, regardless of cost or consequence, a reputation that would shape how other Imperial forces viewed the First Legion in the years that followed. The Night Lords who survived the Thramas Crusade carried their own psychological scars, though these manifested as an intensification of existing pathologies rather than the development of new ones. The 8th Legion had always been brutal and had always relied on terror as their primary weapon, but the experience of fighting a 3-year campaign where these methods proved insufficient to achieve decisive victory created a sense of nihilistic despair among many Night Lords warriors. If terror tactics could not force the Dark Angels to break, if atrocities conducted on a scale that defied comprehension could not compel their enemies to withdraw, then what purpose did the Night Lords serve? What role could they play in a galaxy where even their most extreme methods failed to achieve their intended effects? This existential crisis manifested differently among different Night Lords companies. Some responded by escalating their brutality even further, conducting atrocities that served no military purpose whatsoever in a desperate attempt to prove that terror remained an effective weapon. These companies became little more than roving bands of murderers, their operations characterized by sadism that exceeded even the extreme standards the 8th Legion had established during the Great Crusade. Other Night Lords companies withdrew from active operations entirely, their warriors concluding that continued resistance was futile, and that the only rational response to an insane galaxy was to seek whatever pleasure or satisfaction could be found before inevitable death claimed them. The fragmentation of the Legion's command structure meant that there was no institutional mechanism for addressing these psychological problems, or for maintaining any semblance of unit cohesion beyond the company level. Individual captains dealt with morale and discipline issues within their own forces according to their personal preferences, with no higher authority to impose standards or to intervene when companies descended into complete dysfunction. The result was a collection of warbands whose behavior ranged from disciplined terror operations that maintained some connection to military objectives to random violence that served no purpose beyond satisfying the perpetrator's psychological needs. The doctrinal changes that emerged from the Thramas Crusade affected both legions' approaches to warfare in ways that would persist long after the heresy concluded. The Dark Angels formalized many of the tactical innovations that had been developed during the campaign, incorporating lessons learned about fighting other astartes into their training regimens and operational procedures. The emphasis on intelligence gathering and on maintaining multiple redundant communications networks became standard practice, as did the deployment of specialized kill teams designed specifically for anti-Astartes operations. The Firewing's role expanded to include not just operations against conventional enemies, but also the hunting of traitor space marines, a mission that would consume increasing amounts of the Wing's attention in the years following the heresy. The experience of fighting an enemy who used civilian populations as shields and who conducted operations in urban terrain where conventional firepower superiority provided limited advantage led to changes in how the Dark Angels approached planetary assault operations. The Legion developed new tactics for urban warfare that emphasized the isolation and systematic clearance of defensive positions, accepting that such operations would be time-consuming but prioritizing thoroughness over speed. The willingness to deploy Dreadwing assets in urban environments became normalized, with rad weapons and phosphex accepted as legitimate tools for reducing fortified positions that could not be overcome through conventional assault. The Night Lord's doctrinal evolution following Thramas was less coherent due to their fragmented state, but certain patterns emerged across multiple companies that suggested common lessons had been learned. The experience of fighting a prolonged campaign against an enemy who could match their void warfare capabilities and who possessed superior ground combat strength reinforced the Night Lord's existing preference for avoiding decisive engagement. The companies that survived the Thramas Crusade became even more focused on hit and run operations and on targeting vulnerable enemies who could not effectively resist, rather than engaging in the kind of sustained combat that had characterized the final battles on Saguelsa. The Lion's decision regarding the division of his legion following the conclusion of active operations at Saguelsa reflected both strategic necessity and the complex political situation that had developed during the 3 years the Dark Angels had been engaged in the Thramas Crusade. Reports from Ultramar indicated that Robute Guilliman had established Imperium Secundus and was consolidating loyalist forces in the 500 worlds, creating a backup capital for the Imperium in case Terra fell to the traitors. The Ruinstorm continued to block direct routes from the eastern fringe to the Throne World, making it impossible for the Dark Angels to reach Terra, even if the Lion decided to attempt the journey. The strategic logic of concentrating loyalist forces in Ultramar was compelling, but the Lion's pride and his complicated relationship with Guilliman created hesitation about simply subordinating the Dark Angels to his brother's authority. The compromise that emerged involved dividing the Legion's remaining strength between multiple objectives. The Lion would lead approximately 20,000 Dark Angels toward Ultramar, bringing sufficient force to make a meaningful contribution to Imperium Secundus, while retaining enough independence to avoid the appearance of simply following Guilliman's orders. Another force of approximately 5,000 Astartes would remain in the Thramas Sector and surrounding regions, conducting operations to hunt down the scattered Night Lord's companies and to secure the systems that had been contested during the campaign. These forces would operate with significant autonomy, their commanders receiving broad guidance about objectives, but being left to determine their own methods for achieving those goals. A third group, smaller than the other two, but consisting of some of the Legion's most experienced warriors, received orders to attempt the journey to Terra despite the Ruinstorm. The Lion recognized that even if the warp storm made direct transit impossible, there might be routes around its periphery or brief windows when passage became feasible. These dark angels would search for any means of reaching the throne world, carrying word of the First Legion's loyalty and of the casualties they had sustained fighting the traitors in the Eastern Fringe. The division of the Legion reflected the Lion's unwillingness to commit entirely to any single course of action, a characteristic caution that had served him well during the Great Crusade, but which created its own problems in the fluid strategic situation of the heresy. The implementation of this division consumed weeks as the Dark Angels reorganized their forces and redistributed supplies and equipment among the different groups. Ships that had sustained damage during the Tsagualsa operation underwent what repairs could be accomplished with available resources, though many vessels remained in compromised condition due to the lack of proper shipyard facilities. The Astartes themselves were reorganized into new formations that combined survivors from companies that had been reduced below effective strength, creating units that maintained combat capability, but which lacked the cohesion that came from warriors who had trained and fought together for decades. The departure of the Lion's force toward Ultramar marked the effective end of the Thramas Crusade as a unified campaign, though fighting would continue in the sector for months as the remaining Dark Angels hunted scattered Night Lord's elements. The journey toward the 500 worlds would take the Lion and his forces through regions where the Ruinstorm's effects created navigational hazards and where the strategic situation remained unclear. The Dark Angels who accompanied their Primarch understood that they were heading toward an uncertain future, one where their role in the larger heresy remained undefined, and where the political complications of Imperium Secundus would require careful navigation. The forces that remained behind to secure the Thramas Sector and hunt the surviving Night Lords faced a different kind of challenge. The scattered 8th Legion companies continued to pose threats to Imperial worlds throughout the region, conducting raids and terror operations that required constant vigilance to counter. The Dark Angels assigned to this mission understood that they were engaging in a grinding campaign of attrition that might last for years, hunting enemies who refused decisive battle and who could disappear into the vast spaces between stars whenever pressure became too intense. The mission lacked the glory of major fleet actions or the clear objectives of planetary conquest, but it represented necessary work that would protect Imperial citizens from the depredations of traitors who had demonstrated their willingness to inflict suffering for its own sake. The Thramas Crusade's conclusion left wounds that never truly healed, scars that would define both the Dark Angels and the Night Lords for the 10,000 years that followed. The campaign had consumed 3 years of brutal warfare during the opening stages of the Horus Heresy, years when both legions might have contributed to the larger conflict raging across the galaxy. Instead, they had fought each other to exhaustion in a sector that held strategic importance, but which ultimately became a sideshow to the Siege of Terra and the heresy's other decisive battles. The consequences of this mutual destruction would echo through the millennia, shaping both legions in ways that neither Primarch could have fully anticipated when they first committed their forces to the Thramas Sector. The Dark Angels who survived the Thramas Crusade carried knowledge that would become the foundation of their chapter's most closely guarded secret. During the final battles on Tsagualsa, and in the chaotic period that followed, some Night Lords warriors had spoken of corruption within the First Legion itself, of Dark Angels who had turned traitor and who fought alongside Horus's forces. These claims seemed impossible at first, dismissed as psychological warfare designed to sow discord among the loyalist forces. The truth proved more complicated and more damaging than simple enemy propaganda. The Dark Angels who had been left behind on Caliban when the Legion departed for the Great Crusade had indeed turned against the Emperor, though the exact circumstances and timing of their betrayal would not become clear until the Lion and his forces finally returned to their homeworld. The destruction of Caliban occurred in the heresy's final days, when the Lion led his forces back to the Legion's homeworld and discovered that Luther, his former mentor and the man he had left in command of the planet, had succumbed to chaos corruption. The battle that followed saw the planet torn apart by warp storms and orbital bombardment, its surface reduced to the asteroid field that would become known as the Rock. The traitor Dark Angels scattered across the galaxy during Caliban's destruction, escaping into the warp before the Loyalists could eliminate them completely. These fallen warriors became known within the chapter as the Fallen, and their existence represented a shame so profound that the Dark Angels would spend the next 10 millennia hunting them in absolute secrecy. The obsession with capturing or killing the Fallen consumed the Dark Angels chapter in ways that affected every aspect of their operations and culture. The Inner Circle, consisting of the chapter's most senior members and those few who knew the full truth about Caliban's destruction, maintained elaborate systems for tracking rumors of Fallen sightings and for deploying forces to capture these traitors before other Imperial institutions could discover their existence. The Raven Wing became the chapter's primary reconnaissance and pursuit force, their speed and mobility making them ideal for responding rapidly to intelligence about Fallen locations. The Deathwing served as the ultimate sanction, Terminator-armored veterans who could be trusted with the truth about the Fallen and who possessed the skill and equipment necessary to capture or kill these ancient traitors. The secretive nature that had characterized the Dark Angels during the Great Crusade intensified dramatically after the heresy's conclusion. The chapter maintained information compartmentalization that exceeded even the standards common among Astartes forces, with knowledge about the Fallen restricted to progressively smaller circles of warriors as the sensitivity of the information increased. Standard Battle Brothers knew nothing of the Fallen's existence, told only that certain operations required absolute secrecy for reasons they were not permitted to question. Company masters and other senior officers learned portions of the truth as they advanced through the chapter's ranks, each revelation accompanied by oaths of secrecy that bound them to maintain the deception even from their own brothers. The hunt for the Fallen took precedence over virtually every other consideration, including direct orders from Imperial command authorities and even from the High Lords of Terra themselves. Dark Angels' forces would abandon battlefields where their presence was desperately needed if intelligence suggested that a Fallen had been located elsewhere, their departure often occurring without explanation or warning to Allied forces who had been depending on their support. This behavior earned the chapter a reputation for unreliability and for prioritizing their own mysterious agenda over the Imperium's broader strategic needs. The Dark Angels accepted this damaged reputation as a necessary cost of maintaining secrecy about the Fallen, calculating that suspicion and resentment from other Imperial institutions represented a lesser evil than the revelation that elements of the First Legion had turned traitor. The methods employed in hunting the Fallen reflected lessons learned during the Thramas Crusade about fighting enemies who refused conventional engagement and who could disappear into civilian populations or hostile territory. The Raven Wing developed sophisticated intelligence networks that monitored Imperial worlds for any signs of Astartes activity that could not be attributed to known chapters, investigating reports of superhuman warriors appearing in locations where no Space Marines should be present. The Deathwing perfected techniques for capturing targets alive despite their transhuman resilience and combat capabilities, recognizing that dead Fallen could not be interrogated about the locations of their brothers or about the extent of their activities since Caliban's destruction. The interrogator chaplains emerged as specialists in extracting information from captured Fallen through methods that combined psychological manipulation with physical torture. These warriors studied the minds of their prisoners, searching for weaknesses that could be exploited to break their resistance and force them to reveal what they knew about other traitors. The interrogator chaplains understood that most Fallen had spent millennia evading capture and had developed considerable resistance to conventional interrogation techniques, requiring approaches that pushed the boundaries of what the Imperium officially sanctioned, even when dealing with traitors and heretics. The goal of these interrogations was not simply to gather intelligence, but to force the Fallen to repent, to acknowledge their betrayal, and to seek forgiveness before execution. The rock itself became the physical manifestation of the Dark Angel's obsession with the fallen. The asteroid that had once been part of Caliban's core was converted into a mobile fortress monastery that served as the chapter's primary base of operations. Deep within the rock's interior, in chambers that existed on no official plans and that were known only to the inner circle, the Dark Angels maintained cells where captured fallen were held and interrogated. These dungeons contained traitors who had been captured centuries or even millennia ago, prisoners who had resisted every attempt at forcing their repentance and who remained confined in conditions that violated every principle of mercy or basic dignity. The existence of these cells and their occupants represented secrets within secrets, knowledge that even most members of the inner circle were not permitted to access. The Thramas Crusade's influence on Dark Angel's tactical doctrine manifested in their approach to warfare against Chaos Space Marines and other traitor Astartes forces. The experience of fighting the Night Lords had taught the First Legion that conventional tactics often proved insufficient against enemies who possessed equivalent transhuman capabilities and who were willing to employ methods that loyalist forces might hesitate to use. The Dark Angels developed specialized equipment and techniques for anti-Astartes combat, including weapons optimized for penetrating power armor and tactics, designed to counter the enhanced reflexes and resilience of Space Marine opponents. The Deathwing's preference for Terminator armor reflected lessons learned on Sagualsa about the value of maximum protection when fighting in environments where every enemy could potentially kill even veteran warriors. The psychological dimensions of warfare that the Night Lords had employed so effectively during the Thramas Crusade influenced how the Dark Angels approached their own operations in the millennia that followed. The chapter understood that terror could be a weapon, that the threat of overwhelming retaliation could sometimes achieve objectives more efficiently than actual combat. The Dark Angels cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness in pursuing their objectives, ensuring that those who opposed them understood that resistance would be met with complete destruction. This approach served the dual purpose of making their military operations more efficient while also discouraging the kind of detailed scrutiny that might reveal information about the Fallen or about the chapter's other secrets. The Night Lords who survived the Thramas Crusade scattered across the galaxy as independent warbands, each pursuing its own agenda with minimal regard for coordination with other elements of the 8th Legion. The fragmentation that had begun during the campaign's final stages accelerated in the centuries that followed, as individual companies lost contact with each other, and as the absence of any central authority allowed divergent interpretations of Night Lord's doctrine to develop. Some warbands maintained the terror tactics that had defined the Legion during the Great Crusade, conducting raids against Imperial worlds where they could inflict maximum psychological damage with minimal risk to themselves. These operations served no strategic purpose in most cases, as the scattered Night Lords lacked the strength to hold territory or to achieve meaningful military objectives, but they allowed the warbands to continue their existence and to validate their identity as warriors rather than simple pirates. Other Night Lords' warbands descended into behavior that bore little resemblance to the disciplined terror operations of the Great Crusade era. These groups became little more than roving bands of murderers and torturers, their operations motivated by sadism rather than by any tactical or strategic calculation. The distinction between military operations and simple atrocity blurred to the point of meaninglessness for these warbands, whose members had concluded that the only purpose their existence served was to inflict suffering on others before their own inevitable deaths. The psychological damage that centuries of continuous warfare and the knowledge of their own damnation had inflicted on these Night Lords manifested in behavior that shocked even other Chaos Space Marines, earning the 8th Legion a reputation as one of the most depraved and dangerous traitor forces in the galaxy. The absence of Konrad Curze as a unifying figure contributed significantly to the Night Lord's fragmentation and decline. The Night Haunter's fate remained uncertain for years after the Thramas Crusade's conclusion, with some Night Lords claiming their Primarch had survived and would eventually return to lead them, while others insisted he had perished on Sagualsa. The truth emerged only when an Imperial assassin of the Calidus Temple successfully located and killed Curze on the world of Sagualsa, where the Night Haunter had apparently been living in isolation since the campaign's end. Curze's death, which he apparently allowed to occur without resistance, removed any possibility of the 8th Legion reunifying under their Primarchs' command, and confirmed for many Night Lords that their damnation was complete and irreversible. The Night Lords' continued use of terror tactics in the millennia following the heresy established them as one of the most feared Chaos Space Marine forces, despite their fragmented state and relatively small numbers compared to other traitor legions. The 8th Legion's reputation preceded them, with Imperial worlds that received reports of Night Lords' activity, often experiencing panic and social breakdown before the traitors even arrived. This psychological effect multiplied the impact of Night Lords' operations beyond what their actual military strength would suggest, allowing small warbands to achieve disproportionate effects through carefully orchestrated displays of brutality. The flayed skin and bones that decorated Night Lords' armor served as instant identifiers that triggered terror responses in populations who had heard stories about the 8th Legion's methods, creating conditions where resistance often collapsed before serious fighting began. The tactical innovations that the Night Lords had developed during the Thramas Crusade influenced how they conducted operations in the long war that followed the heresy's conclusion. The experience of fighting a prolonged campaign against an enemy who possessed superior numbers and firepower had reinforced the value of mobility and of avoiding decisive engagement. Night Lords' warbands became experts at hit-and-run attacks, striking at targets when they were most vulnerable and withdrawing before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The 8th Legion's preference for operating in small, independent units that could disperse quickly when threatened made them extremely difficult to pin down and eliminate, as Imperial forces that attempted to hunt Night Lords' warbands often found themselves pursuing shadows that disappeared whenever confronted with superior strength. The strategic what-if analysis regarding how the heresy might have unfolded differently had the Dark Angels reached Terra earlier requires careful consideration of the forces involved and the timeline of events. The Dark Angels deployed approximately 50,000 Astartes to the Thramas Sector at the campaign's beginning, a force that represented one of the largest concentrations of loyalist space marines outside of Terra and Ultramar. If Lionel Johnson had chosen to bypass the Night Lords and proceed directly to the throne world, his forces might have arrived months or even years before Horus launched his final assault on the Imperial Palace. The addition of 50,000 Dark Angels to Terra's defenses would have significantly altered the strategic calculus of the siege, potentially forcing Horus to commit additional forces to the assault or to delay his attack until he could be certain of overwhelming the enhanced defenses. The Dark Angels' specialized capabilities would have provided the defenders with options that were not available with the forces that actually fought at Terra. The Dreadwing's mass destruction weapons could have been employed against traitor forces attempting to breach the palace walls, creating killing zones that would have exacted terrible casualties from attacking units. The Deathwing's Terminator armored veterans would have reinforced the most critical defensive positions, providing elite troops capable of holding against sustained assault by traitor Astartes. The Firewing could have conducted operations behind traitor lines, assassinating enemy commanders and disrupting logistics networks in ways that might have delayed or complicated Horus's preparations for the final assault. The void warfare capabilities that the Dark Angels' fleet represented would have strengthened Terra's orbital defenses significantly. The invincible reason alone would have provided firepower equivalent to multiple standard battleships, and its presence in the Sol system would have complicated traitor fleet operations considerably. The dozens of battle barges and hundreds of strike cruisers that accompanied the Lion's flagship would have allowed the defenders to contest orbital space more effectively, potentially preventing some of the orbital bombardment that damaged the Imperial Palace's outer defenses during the historical siege. The Dark Angels' experience in void combat and their disciplined approach to fleet operations would have provided the kind of coordinated resistance that might have inflicted significantly higher casualties on the traitor fleet during its approach to Terra. The psychological impact of the Dark Angel's presence at Terra would have extended beyond simple numbers and capabilities. The First Legion carried a reputation as the Emperor's Chosen, the first Space Marine Legion, and one of the most formidable military forces in the Imperium. Their presence would have bolstered Defender morale and might have caused some traitor forces to question whether Horus's rebellion could succeed against such concentrated loyalist strength. The Lion's reputation as one of the most skilled Primarchs in matters of warfare would have provided the Defenders with another strategic mind, capable of coordinating large-scale operations, potentially allowing for more effective utilization of the diverse forces that gathered to defend the throne world. The counter-argument to this analysis recognizes that the Dark Angel's absence from Terra was not simply the result of the Thramas Crusade, but reflected larger strategic factors that would have influenced their deployment regardless of whether they fought the Night Lords. The distances involved in traveling from the eastern fringe to Terra were immense even by the standards of the Great Crusade, and the warp routes that connected these regions became increasingly unstable as the heresy progressed. The formation of the Ruin Storm would have blocked the Dark Angel's approach to Terra even if they had not been delayed by fighting in Thramas, suggesting that the Lion's forces might never have reached the throne world regardless of the decisions made during the campaign's opening stages. The lessons learned from Thramas regarding void warfare between Astartes' forces influenced Imperial naval doctrine for millennia after the heresy's conclusion. The campaign demonstrated that Space Marine fleet operations required different approaches than conventional naval warfare, as Astartes vessels prioritized boarding actions and orbital assault capabilities over the kind of long-range gunnery duels that characterized engagements between standard Imperial Navy vessels. The importance of electronic warfare and sensor superiority became apparent during the Thramas Void battles, where the side that could detect enemy movements first and could coordinate their forces more effectively often achieved victory despite numerical or firepower disadvantages. These lessons were incorporated into the training that Space Marine fleet officers received, with particular emphasis on the need for rapid decision-making and aggressive tactics when facing enemies of equivalent capability. The counterinsurgency operations that the Dark Angels conducted against scattered Night Lords' forces after the main campaign's conclusion provided valuable experience in hunting enemy Astartes who refused conventional engagement. The techniques developed for tracking and eliminating small Night Lords units operating in hostile territory became templates for similar operations that other chapters would conduct against Chaos Space Marine warbands in the millennia that followed. The recognition that traitor Astartes could not be defeated through conventional military operations alone, that their elimination required sustained intelligence gathering, and the willingness to commit specialized forces to long-term hunting operations, shaped how the Imperium approached the problem of Chaos Space Marine activity in the Long War. The psychological dimensions of warfare between legions that the Thramas Crusade revealed influenced how the Imperium understood and prepared for conflicts involving Chaos Space Marines. The recognition that traitor Astartes would employ terror tactics and psychological warfare as primary weapons, rather than as supplements to conventional operations, led to changes in how Imperial forces were trained to resist these methods. The emphasis on maintaining morale and unit cohesion in the face of atrocities, designed to provoke emotional responses, became central to anti-chaos doctrine, with commanders learning to recognize when enemy actions were intended to manipulate their decision-making rather than to achieve direct military objectives. The Thramas Crusade stands as one of the Horus Heresy's most significant campaigns, despite its relatively limited impact on the war's ultimate outcome. The mutual destruction that the Dark Angels and Night Lords inflicted on each other removed two legions from effective participation in the heresy's decisive battles, potentially altering the balance of forces at Terra and certainly affecting the strategic situation in the Eastern Fringe. The campaign's legacy persisted long after its conclusion, shaping both the Dark Angels chapter's obsessive hunt for the fallen and the Night Lord's fragmentation into scattered warbands that continue to plague the Imperium 10,000 years later. The lessons learned about void warfare, counter-insurgency against Astartes' forces, and the psychological dimensions of warfare between legions influenced Imperial military doctrine for millennia, ensuring that the blood spilled in the Thramas Sector served purposes beyond the immediate tactical and strategic objectives that drew both forces into conflict. The scars left by 3 years of brutal warfare never healed, becoming instead defining characteristics of both forces that echo through the millennia as eternal reminders of what occurs when brothers turn against each other in the darkness between the stars.